When three brothers stood at the edge of a world they had just won together, how did they decide who got what? Not by strength, not by rank, not by argument. They drew lots. And whatever the lot gave you, you kept it forever. Think about what that means. A piece of the world, sky, sea, or death, decided in an instant. No negotiation, no appeal. Tonight, while you sleep, we are going to answer it. Now, let's go back. Back to the moment the Titanomachy had just ended. Back to 6 gods standing in the silence after a 10-year war, in a world that needed to be divided. The war was over. The Titans were in Tartarus. The Centaurs stood guard at the sealed entrance to the deep. Atlas held the sky at the western edge of the world. The age that had begun with the wounding of Uranus, that had passed through the golden age of Kronos and the 10 years of the Titanomachy, had ended. The world was available. The world was open. The world needed to be governed. 6 gods stood in the aftermath of the war that had remade everything, and the most urgent question of the new age presented itself immediately. Who governs what? The question was not simple. 3 of the 6 Olympians had claims to the broadest domains. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades were brothers of equal divine birth, all children of Kronos and Rhea, none of them subordinate to the others by any principle of seniority or merit that all 3 could accept. Zeus had led the war, but leading a war was not the same as owning its outcome. Poseidon had fought with full force. Hades had contributed his particular capabilities. The victory belonged to all of them, and the 3 sisters had their own domains, their own natures, their own essential qualities that could not simply be assigned to them by someone else's decision because those qualities were already in them. Hera was already the principle of sacred commitment. Demeter was already the fertility of the earth. Hestia was already the warmth of the hearth. These were not rewards to be distributed. They were descriptions of what these beings already were. But for the brothers, the 3 great domains of the world needed to be allocated. And the allocation had to be done in a way that all 3 could accept without the war that had just ended immediately being followed by another one. They drew lots. This is the solution the mythology gives us, and it is worth understanding what drawing lots meant in the ancient world. It was not simply gambling. It was not simply leaving the outcome to chance in the way that rolling dice leaves an outcome to chance. Drawing lots was understood as a way of consulting fate, of allowing the deep structure of what was supposed to be to express itself through a mechanism that bypassed the preferences and the arguments of the beings involved. When you drew lots, you were not saying I do not care about the outcome. You were saying the outcome is determined by something larger than my preference, and I am willing to let that larger thing decide. You were submitting to a process that could not be manipulated by power or by argument or by the kind of force that had just finished being deployed for 10 years across the plain of Thessaly. 3 brothers, 3 domains, 3 lots. Zeus drew the sky, the highest realm, the place from which everything below could be seen and governed. The clouds and storms and lightning and the clear ether above the clouds where the divine breath was purest. The domain that was, in the most literal sense, above everything else. The sky was the appropriate domain for Zeus not simply because he had the lightning bolt. The sky was appropriate for Zeus because of the quality that the years on Crete had developed in him. The sky sees everything simultaneously. It covers everything. It has the broadest perspective. And Zeus, who had grown up with the perspective of someone who needed to understand the whole situation rather than simply one part of it, who had needed to see what was happening around him in order to survive, had exactly that quality. He became the ruler of the sky, and through the sky, the ruler of everything. But the sky was not simply his personal domain. It was also his responsibility. The sky governed the weather that determined whether crops grew. The sky governed the light and the dark that structured every day of every life on the surface below. The sky governed the storms that could destroy fleets and the calm that allowed trade to flow. To rule the sky was to be responsible for the conditions of existence for every living thing on the surface of the world. Zeus understood this. The sky god who had grown up on the ground understood the dependency. He had watched from Crete as the weather affected the island, as rain meant life and drought meant hardship, as the sky's moods were the conditions of everyone below him. He took the sky knowing what it meant to those who lived beneath it. Poseidon drew the sea, 2/3 of the surface of the earth, the vastness that connected every shore and provided the highway of ancient civilization, the ungovernable force that gave life and took it without distinction, the medium in which most of the trade and travel and cultural exchange of the ancient world moved. It was the right domain for Poseidon, not simply because the sea matched his temperament, though it did, the way that the volatile and the powerful and the ungovernable matched each other, but because Poseidon was the being whose force needed the largest possible arena for its expression. Any smaller domain would have been too constrained for what he was. The sea was enormous enough to contain him, just barely, often not quite. He took the trident, and he took the sea, and the sea acknowledged him immediately. The currents organized themselves around his will. The depths opened to him. The fish and the creatures of the deep recognized their governor. The surface of the water, which had been restless for the 10 years of the Titanomachy, settled into the particular quality of the sea when Poseidon is present and not angry. Still powerful, still deep, but no longer the random churning of an ungoverned force. The sea with a master. He built his palace on the ocean floor, in the Aegean, at the deepest point, in the blue-green dark where the pressure was enormous and the light from the surface was a faint memory. Coral and sea gold and the materials of the deep ocean floor, shaped by divine, will into the halls of the ruler of the waters. From there he could feel every movement of every ocean simultaneously, every current and every wave and every tidal shift registered in the palace on the floor of the sea. Now, close your eyes. Take a breath. Picture the third lot being lifted, the one no one spoke of yet, and picture the god who received it standing very still, looking at what it contained, saying nothing, simply understanding what it meant to rule the kingdom that never empties. Hades drew the underworld, the realm of the dead, the kingdom of everything that existed below the surface of the living world. There is always a moment of silence in the tellings of this story when Hades draws the underworld. A beat, a pause, as if the teller needs a moment to acknowledge the weight of what that lot contained. Hades accepted it. This is the thing that most deserves attention. He accepted it. He did not protest. He did not attempt to negotiate a different arrangement. He looked at what the lot had given him, and he understood it, and he accepted it. Why? Because Hades understood something that his brothers perhaps did not understand as clearly. The underworld was not the worst domain. The underworld was in fact the most essential domain. Every living thing died. Every mortal, every hero, every great and small figure of the mythology would one day arrive in his kingdom. His population would only ever grow. His borders would never need defending because what came in never left. His authority was absolute in a way that Zeus's authority over the living world never quite was, because the dead had no ambitions, no rebellions, no competing claims. He was also, in a sense that the mythology would make clear over time, the most just of the three brothers. Zeus was powerful and wise, but also vain and unfaithful and capable of terrible jealousy. Poseidon was powerful and ungovernable and held his grudges for a generation. Hades was impartial. He received what came to him. He judged what needed to be judged. He maintained the order of his realm with a thoroughness and a fairness that the surface world's governance rarely matched. He descended to his kingdom. He took the helmet of invisibility from his head and placed it on a throne. He established the geography of the underworld, the rivers and the meadows and the regions that the mythology would describe in such detail. The Styx, whose waters were the most binding oath in creation. The asphodel meadows where ordinary souls wandered. Elysium, where the great heroes rested in peace. And Tartarus, the deepest place, where the punished were punished in ways that fitted what they had done. He ruled there, without complaint, without the drama that characterized his brothers' governance of their domains. Simply governing, with the patience and the thoroughness of a being who understood that what he did was necessary and that necessary things deserved to be done well. The surface of the earth, the land between the sky and the sea and the underworld, was not assigned to any single brother. It was shared. All three of them could walk it. All three had rights to it. All three could involve themselves in what happened there. This arrangement would prove to be a source of endless conflict. When Poseidon and Athena competed for Athens, they were competing for influence over the surface world. When Zeus and Poseidon both pursued mortal women, they were both operating in the shared territory of the surface. When Hades came up to claim Persephone, he was ascending from his domain into the shared world above. The surface world was the contested territory of the divine order, the place where the three realms touched, where the sky came down in rain, where the sea reached its shores, where the dead were buried into the earth from which they would eventually descend to Hades. The intersection of all three domains, governed by none of them alone. This is also the world where mortals lived, the beings who were subject to all three brothers simultaneously, who breathed the air of Zeus's sky and ate the grain from Demeter's earth and depended on Poseidon's sea and would one day belong to Hades' kingdom. The mortals were the citizens of the intersection, living at the point where all three great domains met. The world had been divided. The age of the Olympians had begun, and in the shared territory of the surface, the entanglement of the divine and the mortal that would generate the mythology's greatest stories was already beginning to stir. The three brothers had drawn their lots and taken their domains. But the division of the world was not complete with the brothers alone. The three sisters had their own natures, their own essential qualities, their own relationships to the world that needed to be acknowledged and established. Not through the drawing of lots, not through any process of allocation by an external authority. The sisters' domains were not assigned to them. They were recognized. The world looked at what each of them was and understood what each of them governed, because what they governed was already visible in who they were. Before the sisters, their mother, Rhea had not been swallowed. She had not been imprisoned. She had endured the golden age as the queen beside Kronos, holding her grief in silence across 5 swallowings and then finding her way through the 6th. She had gone to Gaia. She had carried a stone to Kronos. She had left her child in a cave on Crete and watched the world continue as if nothing had changed while everything had changed. And now her children were free. The 6 gods she had produced stood in the world for the first time simultaneously, alive and present and governing the age that had replaced their fathers. What did Rhea become in this new order? She became the Great Mother of the Gods, not a title with specific governance attached, not a domain with boundaries and powers like the sky or the sea, something more fundamental than that. The recognition that the Olympian order had a source, that it had come from somewhere, that the 6 children who now divided the world between them had a mother who had suffered to bring them into existence and had found the courage to save the last one when 5 had already been lost. The ancient Greeks honored Rhea with the deep respect that they gave to things that were old and foundational. She was a titan, older than the Olympians, from the generation that had governed before. She was associated with Cybele, the great mother goddess of Asia Minor, a tradition older than the Greek one that the Greeks absorbed and partially identified with their own Rhea. The mother of the gods, the source of the divine generation that now ruled the world. She was worshipped with music and ecstatic dance and the clashing of cymbals. The instruments of the Curetes who had guarded Zeus in his infancy were the instruments of her worship. The noise that had hidden the first cry of the hidden god became the noise that honored the mother who had made the hiding necessary and possible. She was also, in some traditions, associated with lions. The lion was the animal of sovereignty, of power that did not need to prove itself, of the force that was simply present and unmistakable. Rhea was sometimes depicted riding a chariot drawn by lions, or seated on a throne with lions at her side. The mother of the gods, riding between lions, having come through what she had come through with the particular dignity of someone whose suffering had been real and whose endurance had been necessary and whose actions had changed the world. She withdrew from active governance. This too was part of what she became. The Olympians ruled. Rhea was present as the source from which they had come, honored and acknowledged, but not engaged in the day-to-day management of the divine order. She had done her work. The work had been enormous, and now she rested in the recognition of what her endurance had made possible. Demeter took the fertility of the earth. She did not need to be given it. It was already hers. It had been hers from the moment of her first step out of Kronos' body, when the green things had grown in her footsteps. The connection between Demeter and the growth of living things was as immediate and as unquestionable as the connection between Poseidon and the sea. You did not assign Demeter the fertility of the earth. You recognized that the fertility of the earth was Demeter. Her domain was the agricultural cycle, the planting and the growing and the harvest. The grain that the ancient world depended on for its most basic survival. The wheat and the barley that became the bread that sustained the civilization that built the temples and the ships and the philosophy and everything else. But her domain was larger than agriculture in the narrow sense. She governed the relationship between the living and the earth itself. The fact that things grew from the ground. The fact that seeds placed in soil in autumn became grain by late spring. The fact that the earth was not simply a passive medium in which growing happened, but an active participant in the process, giving what it gave because the goddess who governed the giving was in proper relationship with it. When Demeter withheld her gift, the earth withheld its produce. When Demeter was in grief, the earth reflected that grief in barrenness. The most famous expression of this was the story of Persephone's abduction, which we will tell in full in a later section of this mythology. When Hades took Persephone to the underworld, Demeter's grief was so complete that she withdrew her care from the earth entirely. The grain stopped growing. The trees stopped bearing fruit. The world began to die, and Zeus had to negotiate a compromise, because without Demeter's gift the mortal world could not sustain itself. And without mortal worship, the divine world lost the devotion that gave it meaning. This story, which would become one of the most important in the entire Greek religious tradition, was also the explanation for winter. The months when Persephone was in the underworld with Hades were the months when Demeter's grief was at its most acute and the earth was at its most barren. The months when Persephone returned to the surface were the months of spring and growth, when Demeter's joy expressed itself in the explosion of green things that the ancient world experienced as the renewal of life after the death of winter. Every farmer in Greece knew Demeter, not as a theological abstraction, as the presence in the field, the force that determined whether the seed germinated or rotted, whether the grain headed or failed, whether the harvest would feed the family or leave it hungry. Demeter was the difference between a good year and a bad year. And in the ancient world, the difference between a good year and a bad year was sometimes the difference between life and death. She was worshipped accordingly. Her festivals were the most widely observed in the Greek world. The Thesmophoria, celebrated by women in autumn at the time of the autumn planting, was one of the oldest religious ceremonies in Greece. The Eleusinian mysteries, held in her honor at Eleusis, were the most sacred ceremonies in the entire classical world. Initiates came from across the Greek-speaking world to participate, including the greatest philosophers and the most powerful rulers, all of them coming to honor the goddess of grain, to acknowledge their dependence on what she gave, to seek the deeper understanding of life and death that her mythology offered. Demeter settled into her domain with the thoroughness that was her nature. The earth responded to her presence. The agricultural cycle stabilized. The seasons found their proper rhythm. And the mortals below, who depended on that rhythm for everything, offered their gratitude in the forms that gratitude takes when what you are grateful for is the continuation of your existence. Hestia took the hearth. Of all the domains in the new divine order, Hestia's was the simplest and the most universal. She did not govern the sky or the sea or the realm of the dead or the fertility of the earth or the institution of marriage. She governed the fire at the center of every home. Every home, not just the great temples, not just the palaces of kings and the houses of the wealthy. Every home in the Greek world, from the most elaborate palace to the most modest farmer's dwelling, had a hearth. And in every one of those hearths, in every one of those fires, Hestia was present. Actually present, not symbolically, not metaphorically. The fire was her. Her presence was the warmth. This made Hestia the most universally present deity in the Greek pantheon. More present than Zeus, whose authority over the sky and the weather was felt but not intimate. More present than Poseidon, whose sea was not in every home. More present than any of the Olympians whose domains were specific and geographic. Hestia was in every home because every home had fire. She was everywhere. She was also the most consistent. The hearth fire was supposed to burn continuously. Letting the hearth fire go out was an ill omen, a sign that something was wrong in the household, a break in the continuity that Hestia represented. Every morning the fire was tended. Every evening it was banked to ensure it would survive the night. The relationship between a Greek household and its hearth fire was a daily relationship, more frequent and more immediate than the relationship with any other deity. Before any meal was eaten, before any significant action was undertaken, the hearth was honored. A small offering was thrown into the fire. A brief acknowledgement that the warmth that made the home livable was a divine gift and deserved recognition. This practice was so embedded in Greek life that it required no prompting and no priestly instruction. It was simply what you did. You honored Hestia before you ate. You tended her fire morning and evening. You kept the warmth going because the warmth was her, and she had been present in your home longer than any other divine being. She had declined marriage. Poseidon had sought her hand, and Apollo had sought her hand, and Hestia had asked Zeus instead for the right to remain a virgin, to remain unmarried, to devote herself entirely to the sacred fire. Zeus had granted this request, which meant that Hestia was one of the three virgin goddesses, along with Athena and Artemis. The virgin goddesses, in the Greek understanding, were not simply goddesses who had chosen celibacy. They were goddesses who had chosen a specific form of autonomy, who had chosen not to be defined by their relationship to a male divine being, who had chosen their own purpose as their primary identity. Hestia's purpose was the fire, the warmth, the center of the home around which the family gathered. She gave up everything that divine status might have offered in terms of power and glory and the kind of story that made a god famous, and she chose instead to tend the fire in every home in the world, every day, without recognition, without drama, without the kind of mythology that told of adventures and conquests and transformations. Just the fire, just the warmth, just the presence that made a house a home. She also received the first and last offering at every divine ceremony. Before the great gods were honored, Hestia was honored. After the ceremony was complete and the other deities had received their due, Hestia received a final offering. First and last, Alpha and Omega of the divine world's rituals, the most modest goddess with the most universal presence, given the honor of framing every ceremony from its beginning to its end. In some traditions, Hestia gave up her throne on Olympus to Dionysus when the wine god arrived, and there was a question of where he would sit. She stepped back. She offered her place. She chose the hearth over the throne. The mythology presents this not as a sacrifice, but as a choice entirely consistent with who she was. The throne on Olympus was the kind of thing that beings who needed recognition sought. Hestia did not need recognition. She needed the fire to burn. And so she stepped back from the throne and tended the fires of the divine household on Olympus and the fires of every household below, everywhere in the world, simultaneously, as she had always done. Quietly, faithfully, without complaint. The oldest swallowed child of Kronos and Rhea, the first to be imprisoned and the last to be freed. The goddess who had been through everything and come through it with the same essential quality intact. The warmth that gathers people together. The light that makes the evening livable. The fire that says, "Here is home. Here you are safe. Here you belong." That was Hestia's domain. That was what she chose. And in choosing it, she gave the world something that none of the more powerful, more dramatic, more famous gods could give. The daily reminder that the sacred was not only in the sky or the sea or the great temples. The sacred was in the fire in the center of your home, present when you woke, present when you slept, present every day of your life from birth to death, warming everything, asking for nothing, simply being what it was. The warmth, always the warmth. Hera and Zeus came together, brother and sister, king and queen, the ruler of the sky and the goddess of the sacred bond, entering into the bond that she herself embodied. The marriage of Zeus and Hera was not simply a personal arrangement between two divine beings. It was the founding act of the divine order's domestic structure, the establishment of the household at the center of everything. Before we follow this marriage into its complications, which were many and well documented and begin almost immediately, we need to understand what the marriage actually was and what it meant in the world the Greeks inhabited. In the ancient Greek world, marriage was not primarily a romantic arrangement. It was a social and legal institution, the structure through which property was transferred between families, through which alliances were formed and maintained, through which children were given legitimate status and the legal protections that came with legitimacy, through which the transmission of everything from one generation to the next was organized and guaranteed. Marriage was the foundational unit of civilization. Without stable marriages, without the reliable structure of the household and its legitimate lineage, the whole architecture of Greek social life became uncertain. Property rights depended on legitimate succession. Political alliances depended on marriages that held. The transmission of culture, wealth, and status from one generation to the next depended on the stability of the family unit. Hera was the goddess of this institution, the divine guardian of everything that marriage was supposed to be and do. She presided over the ceremony of marriage, the oaths that bound two people to each other, the household that resulted from those oaths, the children born within it. She was the force that said, "This promise matters. This commitment is sacred. The bond you have made is real, and it creates obligations that persist regardless of whether honoring those obligations is convenient." And now she was entering into this institution with Zeus. The mythology describes the courtship in ways that vary across different ancient sources. Some accounts say Zeus pursued Hera for a long time before she agreed, that she was not simply his for the asking, that the goddess of marriage understood the weight of the commitment she was about to make and did not make it lightly. One of the most famous versions of the courtship involves Zeus transforming himself into a small, shivering cuckoo in a rainstorm. Hera, moved by compassion for the apparently helpless bird, brought it inside and held it against her body to warm it, at which point Zeus revealed himself and declared his love. Hera, confronted with the reality of what she was being asked, agreed to marry him on the condition that the marriage be honorable and permanent. He agreed. The condition was not kept. This is the central tragedy of Hera's existence in the mythology, and we will return to it many times. But the condition was made. The promise was given, and Hera, the goddess of the sacred bond, entered into her marriage with the promise of a husband who would honor it, with the reasonable expectation that the king of gods would govern his own household according to the principles that he governed everything else. The wedding of Zeus and Hera was the first divine wedding, the ceremony that all subsequent divine and human marriages would in some sense echo, the model, the original instance of the institution that Hera herself embodied. It was celebrated on the island of Samos, according to some ancient sources, or in the garden of the Hesperides according to others. The specific location varied, but the character of the event was consistent. It was extraordinary, the first time that the divine couple who would govern the Olympian order had formalized their union. Gaia gave them a wedding gift, a tree that bore golden apples. The tree was planted in the garden at the western edge of the world, where the Hesperides tended it and the serpent laid and guarded it. The golden apples that would later be sought by Heracles as one of his 12 labors, that would be thrown by Eris at the wedding feast that began the chain of events leading to the Trojan War. These apples were Gaia's gift to Hera at her wedding. The oldest being in existence honoring the new queen of the gods with a tree at the edge of the world that produced the most precious fruit in creation. The gods celebrated. The muses sang. The graces danced. The divine community that was assembling itself in the new age honored the marriage of its king and queen with the kind of ceremony that marked the beginning of a new era. which is what it was. The marriage of Zeus and Hera was not simply a personal event. It was the establishment of the divine household that the Olympian order would be organized around. Hera became the queen of the gods, not because Zeus made her queen, not because the title was bestowed on her by any external authority. She became queen because she was Hera, and Hera was the queen. The quality of her presence, the authority that had been visible in her from the first moment of her life, the pride that had survived even the darkness inside Kronos' body, all of it expressed itself now in the role that matched it perfectly. She sat on a golden throne beside Zeus on Olympus. Two thrones, equal in magnificence, reflecting the understanding that the divine household required two presences of equal dignity to govern it. He was the king of gods. She was the queen. The distinction between them was not one of superiority and subordination. It was one of domain and function. He governed the sky and all that was beneath it. She governed the institution of marriage and all that it sustained. Her symbols were the peacock, with its extraordinary display of eyes and its tail, seeing in every direction simultaneously. The pomegranate, the fruit of marriage and fertility. The cow, the most valuable domestic animal in the ancient world, the animal whose care and whose products were central to the running of the household she governed. And the cuckoo, the bird that Zeus had become to win her, now forever associated with her in the mythology's visual language. She was worshipped across the entire Greek world. Her temples at Argos, at Samos, at Olympia were among the largest and most important religious sites in Greece. The Heraion at Samos was one of the earliest monumental temples in the Greek world, begun in the 8th century BCE and continuously developed for centuries afterward. The Heraion at Olympia was similarly ancient, one of the oldest stone temples in Greece. The worship of Hera was not the worship of romance. It was the worship of the institution of marriage and the stability that marriage provided. Women in particular honored her at the transitions of their lives. At marriage, obviously, but also at other moments when the sacred bonds of human relationship were being established or tested. She was the divine presence at the moments when people committed to each other, when they made the promises that the rest of their lives would be organized around. The marriage of Zeus and Hera produced children. Ares, the god of war. Hebe, the goddess of youth, who served as cupbearer to the gods. Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth. And in some traditions, Hephaestus, though his birth story was complicated and contested. It also produced the central drama of Hera's divine existence. Zeus was unfaithful, not occasionally, not in one or two regrettable instances that could be forgiven and moved past. Comprehensively, repeatedly, across the full span of the mythology, with mortal women and divine beings and nymphs and titanesses and anything else that attracted his attention. The list of Zeus's lovers fills pages in any comprehensive account of the mythology. Io, Europa, Leda, Danae, Alcmene, Semele, Ganymede, Metis, Leto, Mnemosyne, Themis, Demeter, and many others, mortal and divine, each one a violation of the marriage that Hera embodied. Her responses to these violations became central to the mythology. She pursued Io and persecuted her across the world after Zeus had transformed the girl into a cow to hide her. She drove Heracles, the son of Zeus and the mortal Alcmene, to madness, causing him to kill his own children. She tormented Semele into asking for a sight that killed her. She engineered Ixion's punishment for attempting to assault her. These responses have been characterized as jealous and vindictive, and by the standards of any reasonable moral framework, they were often both. But they were also the responses of a being who was the goddess of marriage, watching the most fundamental principle of her existence be violated daily by the being who had promised to honor it. She was not simply a wronged wife. She was the principle of marital fidelity, and the principle was being publicly, repeatedly, comprehensively violated by the king of gods himself. The tragedy of Hera is the tragedy of a being whose entire identity was organized around something that the most powerful being in existence refused to respect. She could not leave. She could not simply exit the marriage and govern her domain from a different position. She was the queen of the gods, married to the king. The institution required her presence. Her presence required her to endure what she endured, and she endured it, with the pride and the fury and the fierce intelligence of a being who knew exactly what was being done to her and who refused to pretend it was acceptable, even when the power differential between her and Zeus made addressing it directly impossible. This is who Hera was as the queen of Olympus, not the gentle consort, not the gracious host, the proud and powerful and deeply wronged goddess of the sacred bond, governing her domain with absolute commitment to its principles, while the being who shared her throne demonstrated daily that those principles applied to everyone except himself. Her marriage was the first marriage, the model, the original instance, and it was, from its very beginning, an illustration of the gap between what marriage was supposed to be and what power made of it. She sat on her throne on Olympus, and she governed what she governed, and she endured what she endured. And she was the queen, unquestionably, unmistakably, with the full weight of her nature and her history and her divine authority. The queen, always the queen. Olympus needed to be built, not the mountain. The mountain had been there since Gaia made the mountains at the beginning of the world, the highest peak in Greece, rising to nearly 3,000 meters, its summit wrapped in clouds for most of the year, visible from an extraordinary distance across the flat plains of Macedonia and Thessaly below it. The mountain was ancient and permanent and required no construction. What needed to be built was what existed above the mountain, the divine palace, the home of the gods, the place that would be the center of the Olympian order for the entirety of the mythology that followed. The ancient Greeks were careful about this distinction. They pointed to Mount Olympus when they spoke of the divine home. They located it there, anchored it to that specific peak, gave it a geographical address in the world they inhabited. But they also understood that what they meant by Olympus was not quite the physical mountain. It was something above the mountain, above the cloud line, in the clear ether, the pure upper air, the atmosphere that existed above the weather and above the turbulence of the lower sky. The home of the gods was in the ether, the medium through which divine light moved. The pure air above the clouds that no mortal could breathe, that no mortal could reach. The gods breathed ether. They moved through it. Their palace was built of it and in it, simultaneously part of the physical world that the mountain anchored them to, and beyond that world in the specific way that the divine was always beyond the mortal. The builder was Hephaestus, the divine craftsman, the smith of the gods, the being whose extraordinary skill with metal and fire and the craft of making had no equal in the divine world except perhaps the Cyclopes, who had made the weapons that won the Titanomachy and who were, in some sense, the ancestors of everything that divine craft could produce. Hephaestus had not yet been born when the Titanomachy ended. His birth story, which we will tell fully in a later section, was one of the most complicated and most contested in the mythology. He was the son of Hera, but the question of whether Zeus was his father or whether Hera produced him alone in response to Zeus's production of Athena was debated across different ancient sources without resolution. What all the sources agreed on was what Hephaestus was. He was the divine craftsman, the being who worked with metal and fire the way musicians worked with sound, with a mastery so complete that the distinction between craft and creation became meaningless. He made things that could not otherwise exist, objects of impossible beauty and impossible function, armor that could not be pierced, nets that could not be broken, palaces that maintained themselves, mechanical servants of golden metal that walked and worked as if alive. He built Olympus, not stone upon stone in the way that mortal builders worked, with the specific divine craft that made what he made into something that exceeded the sum of its materials. Olympus was not simply a large palace in an elevated location. It was a divine construction, built to house the gods and to function as the center of the divine order, and it had properties that no mortal building could have. The walls gleamed. They were described in the ancient sources as shining, as radiant, as catching the light in ways that ordinary stone and metal did not. The material was described variously as bronze, as gold, as something that had no mortal name. Whatever it was the product of Hephaestus's craft, and the product of his craft was always something that exceeded ordinary understanding. The floors were described as smooth and brilliant, reflecting the movements of the gods who walked across them. The columns were described as reaching to heights that made mortal architecture look modest by comparison. The halls were vast enough to contain all the divine beings of the new age simultaneously, with room for their full divine presence, which meant room for something considerably larger than their human-scaled appearances suggested. At the center of Olympus, in the great hall where the gods gathered to feast and to counsel and to make the decisions that governed the world below, 12 thrones were prepared. 12. The number had a significance in the ancient world that went beyond simple counting. 12 was the number of completeness in the Greek and the broader Mediterranean understanding of cosmic order. 12 months in the year. 12 signs in the zodiac through which the sun moved in its annual cycle. 12 tribes of Israel. 12 labors of Heracles. 12 was the number that expressed the full range, the complete set, the all-encompassing enumeration. 12 thrones meant the complete divine order, the full set of governing powers, the comprehensive counsel of everything that needed to be represented for the world to be properly governed. Each throne was made by Hephaestus with the same care and the same divine craft that he brought to everything. Each one was specific to its occupant, not identical, not interchangeable. Each throne expressed something about the nature of the god who would sit on it. Zeus's throne was the largest, with the quality of the sky in its material, the blue of the high atmosphere and the gold of lightning somehow present in its construction. Poseidon's throne had the texture of the deep ocean in it, dark and pressured and full of the weight of water. Hades's throne, though Hades rarely sat on it because he was rarely on Olympus, had the cool gray quality of the underworld stone. Hera's throne was beside Zeus's and of equal magnificence. The peacock's colors were in it, the iridescent display of eyes that was her symbol, the quality of watchfulness that her role required. Demeter's throne had the quality of the good earth in late spring, when the grain was heading and the harvest was still weeks away, but the outcome was already certain. That specific combination of richness and patience and the promise of what was coming. And Hestia's throne was there, though she rarely sat on it. The fire of the hearth was in it, the warm gold of the domestic fire rather than the cold gold of wealth. The seat of the goddess who had chosen the hearth over the throne, preserved for her anyway, because even in her absence she was honored as the first of the Olympians, the first swallowed child, the one who had endured the longest. 6 thrones for the original 6 Olympians, but 12 thrones had been prepared, which meant that 6 more gods were expected. 6 more divine beings who would take their places in the Olympian order and fill out the complete set of the world's governing powers. They were not all yet born. Some of them had not yet arrived in the world. Some of them would arrive through Zeus's many unions with mortal and divine beings in the years to come. Some would arrive through stranger mechanisms, through direct divine production, through births that broke every ordinary rule of how births happened. The thrones waited for them. This is one of the most deliberately suggestive details in the mythology of Olympus. The 12 thrones were prepared before all 12 of the gods who would sit on them had been born. Hephaestus built them all. The divine craftsman made 12, not 6, because he understood, or because the divine order that expressed itself through his craft understood, that the complete Olympian pantheon was 12, even if only 6 of them currently existed. The 6 empty thrones were not a statement about absence. They were a statement about what was coming, about the completeness that was in the process of being achieved, about the divine order still assembling itself, still finding its full form, still discovering which aspects of existence required a governing divine presence. Apollo would come, and music and truth and the light of reason would have their throne. Artemis would come, and the wild places and the hunt and the moon would have their throne. Athena would come, and wisdom and craft and the civilized intelligence would have their throne. Ares would come, and war would have its throne. Aphrodite, already born from the sea foam at the wounding of Uranus, would take her place. Hephaestus himself would sit on the throne he had built when the time for that was right. The 12 thrones, the complete divine order, the full set of governing powers that the world required to be properly governed. They waited in the great hall of Olympus, in the palace above the clouds, in the ether that the gods breathed and through which divine light moved without obstruction. The palace was built. The thrones were prepared. The Olympians gathered there for the first time as a community with a home. What was it like to be there? The mythology gives us glimpses, but not a complete picture. We know the hall was vast. We know the floors shone. We know the gods feasted there, drinking the ambrosia that gave them their immortality, eating the nectar that was their divine food, gathered together in the way that communities gather, conducting the business of governing everything while also conducting the ordinary social life of beings who spent significant time in each other's company. The gatherings were not always harmonious. The mythology records numerous arguments and conflicts that erupted in the divine hall. Zeus and Hera, Ares and Athena, Poseidon and various other gods in competition for earthly territories. The divine community was not a community of perfect harmony. It was a community of powerful beings with distinct natures and competing interests who happened to share a home and a governing responsibility. But it was also something that nothing in the mythology had been before. It was a community. The Titans had been vast and widely distributed, each in their own domain, without the specific daily coexistence that the 12 thrones in the Great Hall implied. The Olympians were together. They feasted together. They argued together. They governed together. They were, in a way that the previous age had not been, a family. A complicated, contentious, sometimes devastating family. But a family. The 12 thrones in the Great Hall of Olympus were the physical expression of this. Each throne waiting for its occupant. Each occupant already present or already on their way. The complete divine order assembling itself around the table of creation. And below Olympus, below the clouds, below the ether, the world went on. Mortals built their cities and planted their fields and sailed their seas. They looked up at the mountain that was the address of the divine, and they wondered what was happening there. They offered their sacrifices and their prayers. They asked for what they needed and feared what they feared. And the thrones waited, and the gods assembled, and the age of Olympus was, at last and fully, underway. Hera bore children. 3 of them came from her union with Zeus. A 4th came from her alone, each of them distinctive, each of them expressing something specific about the divine principle that Hera embodied or about the particular quality of the divine marriage from which they emerged. Children born of the divine marriage were different from children born of Zeus's affairs with mortals or with other divine beings. Those children, the demigods and the heroes and the minor divine figures that Zeus's prolific unions produced, arrived in the world carrying the particular combination of their parents' qualities. But the children of Zeus and Hera, the legitimate children of the divine marriage, the children born from the official union of the king and queen of gods, these were the Olympian children in the fullest sense. Born from the center of the divine order, bearing the full weight of both parents' divine authority. Ares was the god of war. Not war as a political phenomenon, not war as strategy or as the organized conflict between states. War as the experience of the soldier in the moment of battle. The noise and the terror and the blood and the killing. The specific experience of human beings in violent conflict with other human beings, when the ordinary rules of daily life have been suspended and the only thing that matters is whether you survive. This is what Ares was the god of, not military strategy. Athena governed that. Not the just war, the war fought for good reasons in the right way. Zeus and Themis governed that. Ares governed the raw, brutal, visceral reality of combat itself. The moment the spear hits the body, the sound of a shield being shattered, the terror that precedes a charge, the particular madness that settles over a battlefield where too many beings have been killing each other for too long. He was described in the ancient sources as beautiful. This is one of the details that surprises people who have a certain image of the god of war. But the Greeks understood that war and beauty were not opposites. The greatest warriors in the mythology were often the most beautiful. Achilles was both the greatest fighter and the most beautiful man. Ares shared this quality. He was radiant in armor, magnificent in battle. The visual spectacle of the warrior at his peak was part of what Ares embodied. He was also, however, not particularly admired by the other Olympians. Zeus explicitly tells him in the Iliad that he is the most hateful of all the gods. This is not a dismissal of war itself. The Greeks understood that war was real and necessary, and that a god of war was required. But they distinguished between war as a necessary fact of existence and the specific quality of Ares, which was the love of violence for its own sake, the pleasure in killing, the excitement of battle independent of any question of justice or purpose. Ares fought on the Trojan side in the Iliad and was wounded by the mortal Diomedes with the assistance of Athena. The god of war, injured by a mortal because a goddess of wisdom was helping the mortal. The message was clear: raw force without intelligence, rage without strategy, violence without purpose, could be defeated by someone smaller who was thinking clearly. The Greeks valued martial excellence, but they valued intelligence more, and they expressed this valuation in the mythology by giving Ares the domain of combat, while giving Athena the domain of strategy, and then consistently showing that strategy wins. He had children who expressed the qualities at the extremes of his domain. Phobos, fear; Deimos, terror. The two companions who accompanied him into battle, riding with him in his chariot, spreading the psychological preconditions of defeat before the physical fighting had even begun. Fear and terror, the children of war. And Harmonia, discord's opposite, born from the union of Ares and Aphrodite. Love and war producing harmony. The mythology's most counterintuitive genealogy, and perhaps its most honest. Harmony, true harmony, is not the absence of conflict. It is the resolution of conflict. It comes from the meeting of opposing forces, not from their absence. Love and war together produce harmony, because harmony requires both the capacity for connection and the capacity for conflict to be present and balanced. Ares was honored, if not particularly beloved. He received worship, particularly from those whose lives brought them into contact with the reality he governed. Soldiers, warriors, the people who lived and died by the outcomes of battles. He was present in the Thracian traditions of northern Greece, where the warrior culture was strongest. He had his temples, his sacrifices, his festivals. He was also the lover of Aphrodite, in one of the mythology's most famous affairs. The god of war and the goddess of love, bound together in a passion that Hera found unacceptable and Hephaestus found devastating. The story of how Hephaestus discovered the affair and trapped the two lovers in an unbreakable net and exposed them to the mockery of the divine community is one of the mythology's most human moments. A husband betrayed, a craftsman's revenge, the specific pain of discovering that the person you loved has chosen someone else, and the specific satisfaction and the specific humiliation that came from the response. Hebe was the goddess of youth. Her name meant youth in Greek, the specific quality of being young, of having the full vitality and the full potential and the full physical capability of the years before age began its slow diminishment. She was perpetually young herself, as befitted the goddess of the quality. She never aged. She never changed. She was always what youth was at its peak, the combination of beauty and energy and possibility that the passing years eventually replaced with other things. She served as the cupbearer to the gods on Olympus, the being who poured the nectar and the ambrosia that the gods consumed at their divine feasts. This was not a servile role in the ancient understanding. The cupbearer in the ancient world was a position of trust and intimacy. The person who poured your drink was the person you trusted most completely, because the drink could carry whatever the cupbearer chose to put in it. Hebe poured for the gods because she was the daughter of the queen and because her role expressed something about the divine feast that needed expressing. The gods, who were immortal and therefore already beyond the reach of time, were sustained in their immortality by what they consumed. Nectar and ambrosia, the specific divine food and drink, maintained the quality of divine life. And Hebe, the goddess of youth, poured it. Youth sustained the immortals. Youth, perpetually offered, perpetually present, was what kept the divine community in the state that made them divine. She later married Heracles. When the great hero was finally translated to Olympus at the end of his labors and his sufferings, when Zeus recognized him and brought him to the divine community, Hebe became his wife. the goddess of youth and the mortal who had achieved immortality through his extraordinary deeds. Her marriage to Heracles was understood as an expression of his apotheosis, his elevation to divine status. To marry Hebe was to marry youth itself, to marry the quality that the mortal Heracles had pursued in his own way through his extraordinary physical feats. Hephaestus was the most complicated of Hera's children, the most important, the most significant for the mythology, and the one whose birth story was the most contested and the most revealing about the tensions that already existed in the divine marriage. The basic question was, who was his father? One tradition said Zeus was his father, that Hephaestus was the legitimate child of the divine marriage, born in the ordinary way from the union of the king and queen. Another tradition, which Hesiod seems to prefer, said that Hera produced Hephaestus alone, without Zeus, in a specific act of retaliation. The specific act of retaliation was for Athena's birth. Zeus had produced Athena alone, from his own head, without Hera. He had swallowed Métis when she was pregnant and had then given birth himself, literally, to the goddess of wisdom who emerged fully formed and fully armored from his skull. The production of a child without any female participation was the ultimate appropriation of the creative power that the mythology had consistently associated with the feminine. Gaia had created Uranus alone. Hera had been the goddess of the sacred bond, and Zeus had created a daughter without her. Hera's response, in this tradition, was to produce Hephaestus alone, without Zeus, a child of her own, produced by her own divine power, requiring no male participation. A statement that what Zeus could do, she could do. The child she produced was Hephaestus. He was born lame. The specific nature of his lameness varies across the sources. Some say he was born with the deformity. Others say he was born normally and was made lame later, when Zeus threw him off Olympus in a rage, and he fell for a day before landing on the island of Lemnos, where the Sintis, the inhabitants of the island, cared for him. Others say it was Hera who threw him off Olympus, ashamed of the child's imperfection, and that he fell into the sea where the sea nymph Thetis rescued him. Whatever the specific story of how he came to be lame, he was lame. The divine craftsman, the being who would build Olympus and forge the armor of Achilles, and create the mechanical servants and produce the net that trapped Ares and Aphrodite, moved through the world with a limp, with a body that did not have the physical perfection that the ancient world expected of the divine. This too was a statement. The greatest craftsman in existence was not perfect in the way that Apollo was perfect, or Achilles was perfect, or Aphrodite was perfect. His perfection was in what he made, not in what he was. His beauty was in the objects that came from his hands, not in the hands themselves. The ancient Greeks were making an observation about the nature of creative genius that remains true. The creator and the creation are not the same order of thing. The person who makes the most beautiful things does not have to be the most beautiful person. He was thrown out of the divine community, by Zeus or by Hera, depending on the version. He fell to earth or to the sea. He was taken in by mortals or by sea nymphs. He learned his craft in the conditions of the outside world, in the forged fire, in the hammer, in the anvil, working with materials that the divine world had not given him and that he had to find and master himself. And then he returned, with the revenge of a craftsman, which is the most particular and the most satisfying kind of revenge. He sent Hera a golden throne as a gift, a magnificent throne, the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, made with the full power of his divine craft. She sat on it, and the throne closed around her. Invisible bonds, forged into the throne's construction, so subtle that they were undetectable until they were already holding. The queen of the gods, trapped on her own throne. The gods pleaded with Hephaestus to release her. He refused. They sent various gods to negotiate. He refused. Eventually Dionysus, with wine, managed to get Hephaestus drunk enough to be persuaded to return to Olympus and release his mother. The condition of his return was that he be given Aphrodite as his wife. He was given Aphrodite as his wife. The lame craftsman, the god who had been thrown out of his own home, returned with the terms he had demanded and the grudge he had carried. He sat down at the forge that was always his natural place, and he went back to work, making things, extraordinary things, things that the world could not have had without him. He was the craftsman god, the maker, the being in whom creation was the primary act, the essential expression of divine nature. The 12 thrones he built for Olympus, the armor of Achilles, the necklace of Harmonia, the chain net that caught Ares and Aphrodite in their affair, the mechanical servants of golden metal that walked and worked as if alive, the automata of divine creation, the first robots, built thousands of years before the word existed, because the divine craftsman's imagination had no practical limits. Hera's 3 children expressed 3 aspects of the world that the divine marriage had brought into being. Ares was its violence, the force that war released and that no divine order could entirely contain. Hebe was its youth, the vitality that sustained the divine community and that youth always brought to any gathering. And Hephaestus was its creativity, the extraordinary making capacity that emerged from the most complicated and most troubled birth in the mythology of Olympus. 3 children, 3 expressions of what the divine marriage, for all its tragedy and all its difficulty, had produced. The world was fuller for their existence. Before Athena was born, there was Metis. Metis was the first wife of Zeus, not Hera. Metis came before Hera, in the sequence that the mythology establishes for Zeus's unions. Her name meant counsel, or wisdom, or the kind of practical intelligence that knows how to navigate situations that brute force cannot address. She was a daughter of Oceanus and Tethys and Oceanid, one of the 3,000 daughters of the encircling river, and she was, by ancient consensus, the wisest being in creation after Gaia herself. Zeus pursued her. He wanted her wisdom. He wanted the counsel that her nature provided. He wanted access to the specific quality of intelligence that she embodied, the kind that could see through situations, that could find the path that was not obvious, that could understand what was actually happening beneath what appeared to be happening. But there was a prophecy, another prophecy. The mythology of Zeus is structured, in its early stages, by prophecies, by the things that were going to happen regardless of what anyone did to prevent them. This prophecy said that the child of Metis would be greater than its father, that the son, if a son were born, would overthrow Zeus the way Zeus had overthrown Kronos the way Kronos had overthrown Uranus. The wheel again, the pattern again, the child who would replace the parent. Zeus had grown up in the shadow of this pattern. He had been the child whose birth Kronos had tried to prevent. He had been the hidden god on Crete, the secret kept from the father who would swallow him if he could be found. He had lived with the knowledge of the pattern from his earliest consciousness. He understood it the way a being understands something that has shaped their entire existence. And now the pattern was presenting itself to him again. From the other side, he was the powerful one now, the ruler of the world, the being whose child, according to the prophecy, would overthrow him. He was Kronos. He was Uranus. He was standing at the point in the cycle where the fear arrived and the decision had to be made. He did not swallow the child. He swallowed Métis. Before she could give birth, he swallowed the mother, with the child still inside her, while the child was still unborn. It was not the same as Kronos' swallowing of his children, not exactly. This was preemptive. This was not the swallowing of a being who had already arrived in the world. This was the swallowing of a pregnant being before the birth could occur. Métis continued to exist inside Zeus. She continued to think. She continued to counsel, in the specific way that the embodiment of practical wisdom counsels, by being present in the mind of the being who contained her. Zeus, who had swallowed wisdom, now had wisdom accessible to him in a more direct form than any external counselor could provide. Métis spoke to him from inside. She whispered advice. She worked on the armor of the child that was still developing inside her. And inside Zeus, inside the god who had swallowed the goddess of wisdom, the child grew. The birth of Athena was announced by a headache. Zeus felt it coming in the way that terrible pain announces itself. Not immediately overwhelming, but building. Each moment worse than the moment before, until the building had produced something that even a god found unbearable. A pressure inside his skull. A pain that exceeded anything he had experienced in the Titanomachy or in any subsequent conflict. The specific, concentrated agony of something inside his head that needed to come out. He roared. The sound of it shook Olympus. The divine community came running, or arrived in the way that divine beings arrive, immediately present in response to something that required their attention. They found Zeus in extremis, the king of gods reduced to something approaching helplessness by the pain in his head. Hermes understood, or was told by some divine insight, what was needed. He went to Hephaestus, the craftsman, the one with the tools. The solution that the mythology presents is one of the most striking birth stories in any tradition. Hephaestus took his axe, the divine craftsman's axe that was no ordinary tool, and he struck Zeus in the head. Not hard enough to harm the god, not in a way that caused permanent injury, but hard enough, precisely targeted. The craftsman's precision applied to the specific point where the pressure was most concentrated. The skull cracked, and Athena emerged, fully formed, fully grown, fully armored, in the armor that Métis had been making for her inside the god's head while the child was developing, armed with a spear, wearing a helmet, carrying a shield, shouting the war cry. The goddess of wisdom was born armed. The being who would become the patron of civilized intelligence, of the strategic mind, of the arts and the crafts and the governance of cities, arrived in the world with a weapon in her hand and a war cry in her throat. The combination was deliberate. Wisdom without the capacity to defend itself was not the wisdom the mythology was describing. Athena's wisdom was practical wisdom, strategic wisdom, the kind that understood when force was necessary and how to use it effectively. The gods were astonished. Even those who had been expecting something, even those who had understood that the pressure in Zeus's head presaged a birth rather than simply an illness, were not prepared for what emerged. A goddess, fully adult, in full divine panoply, standing on the floor of Olympus and looking at the world with eyes that already understood it. Athena was the goddess of wisdom, craft, and strategic warfare. The combination of these three domains was not accidental. They were aspects of the same underlying quality, the specific intelligence that understood how to make things, how to build, how to design objects and systems and strategies that worked. The intelligence that was not simply the accumulation of knowledge, but the application of knowledge to the achievement of specific goals. Wisdom, in the Greek understanding, was not primarily theoretical. The Greeks had a word for pure intellectual speculation, Sophia, and a different word for the practical wisdom that knew how to act effectively in the world, phronesis. Athena embodied both, but with a bias toward the practical. She was not the goddess of abstract philosophy. She was the goddess of the mind applied to the world. Craft was her domain because craft was the direct application of intelligence to materials. The craftsman takes what exists and transforms it into what is needed. This requires understanding the materials, understanding the techniques, understanding the purpose, and having the skill to bring all three together in the specific act of making. Athena was the patron of every craft in the Greek world. Weaving, pottery, shipbuilding, architecture, all the arts by which humans transformed raw materials into useful and beautiful things. Strategic warfare was her domain because warfare, when it was conducted intelligently, was another form of applied problem solving. The same qualities that made a good craftsman, the ability to understand a situation completely and respond to it with the most effective possible action, made a good general. Athena was the patron of generals, not of soldiers, of the mind behind the battle, not of the battle itself. That distinction, the distinction between strategic intelligence and raw violence, was expressed in the mythology's placement of Athena and Ares as two different kinds of divine relationship to war. She was a virgin goddess. Like Hestia and Artemis, she had chosen not to marry, not to be defined by her relationship to a male divine being. In her case, the choice was more strongly tested than in theirs. Many gods and many mortals tried to approach her. She refused all of them. Her virginity was not prudishness or coldness. It was autonomy, the decision to be defined by her own qualities and her own accomplishments rather than by her relationship to someone else. Her symbol was the owl, the bird of the night that could see in the dark, the creature that perceives what others cannot perceive because it has the specific faculty of perception that the darkness requires. The owl was the visual representation of Athena's quality, the intelligence that could see what was hidden, that could navigate situations that blinded other beings, that could find the truth in conditions where truth was obscured. Her city was Athens, the great city of Greek civilization, the city that produced Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and Sophocles and Aeschylus and Euripides and Thucydides and Herodotus and Pericles. The city that built the Parthenon on the Acropolis, the temple that housed the great statue of Athena Parthenos by the sculptor Phidias, the image of the goddess that was considered one of the wonders of the ancient world. Athens named itself after Athena and worshipped her as its patron. The story of how Athens became Athena's city was the story of her contest with Poseidon. Both gods wanted the city. Poseidon struck the Acropolis with his trident, and a saltwater spring gushed forth. Athena planted an olive tree. The Athenians, invited to judge which gift was more useful, chose the olive tree. Poseidon flooded the coastal plain in his anger, but Athens was Athena's. The choice of the olive tree over the saltwater spring was itself a statement about what Athens valued. The olive tree, which took 20 years to mature but then produced for centuries, which gave fruit and oil and wood and the raw material for one of the most important commodities in Mediterranean trade, was a gift of patience and long-term abundance. The saltwater spring, impressive as a demonstration of divine power, was not useful. You could not drink salt water. You could not irrigate with it. The demonstration of force without practical utility was precisely what Athena's wisdom was designed to transcend. She was, of all the Olympians, the one most directly associated with the specific qualities that the Greeks valued most in themselves: the rational mind, the applied intelligence, the ability to look at a situation and understand it and respond to it effectively, the capacity to make things that were beautiful and useful simultaneously, the wisdom to know when to fight and how to fight and when not to fight. She had emerged from Zeus's head fully formed and fully armed. And in every practical and intellectual achievement of Greek civilization from that point forward, she was present. Her armor never left her. Her owl never stopped watching. And her wisdom, applied to every problem that civilization produced, was the quality that the Greeks most wanted to claim as their own defining characteristic. Born from the head of the sky god, carrying the armor that wisdom herself had made, Athena, Leto was pregnant. The Titaness Leto, daughter of the Titans Zeus and Hebe, granddaughter of the axis of heaven and the original moonlight, was carrying the children of Zeus. Two of them, twins, a son and a daughter who would become two of the most important gods in the entire Greek pantheon. The god of the sun and music and truth and prophecy, and the goddess of the hunt and the moon and the wild places. They were not yet born. They were still inside Leto, still being carried, still waiting for the moment when the world would receive them. And the world was doing everything in its power to prevent that moment from arriving. Hera knew. Of course she knew. Hera always knew. She was the queen of the gods, the goddess of marriage, the being whose entire identity was organized around the sacred bond, and whose entire suffering was organized around the consistent violation of that bond by her husband. When Zeus had another lover, Hera knew. When Zeus produced another child outside their marriage, Hera knew. And Hera acted. She could not stop Zeus. The power differential between them was too great for direct confrontation to be effective, as she had learned repeatedly. But she could make the consequences of his infidelity as severe as possible. She could ensure that the beings who suffered for Zeus's choices suffered comprehensively. She issued a decree, a divine command that carried the force of the queen of the gods behind it. No land that received the light of the sun would provide a resting place for Leto to give birth. Every solid ground, every established piece of earth, was forbidden to her. No place that existed under the sky would shelter her in the moment of her labor. Leto traveled, in the condition that was the most difficult condition in which to travel, carrying two divine children near their time of birth. Pursued by the python that Hera had sent to torment her, she went from place to place seeking what she needed. A ground, a place to stop, a place where the birth could happen. Every established land refused her, not because they were cruel, because they were afraid of Hera. The goddess of marriage had issued her decree, and the lands of the world, the islands and the coastlines and the shores, understood what it meant to defy the queen of the gods. They turned Leto away, one by one. Every place she came to, turned away. This went on. The mythology does not specify how long, but the quality of the account suggests a significant duration. Leto in labor, or near labor, refused everywhere, the snake pursuing her, the divine decree preventing any established ground from offering what she needed. Then she came to Delos. Delos was an island, small and rocky, in the center of the Aegean Sea, in the island group called the Cyclades. It had something unusual about it. In some versions of the mythology, it was not fully anchored to the ocean floor. It floated or drifted or was not quite a fixed piece of land in the way that other islands were fixed. It had the character of something between an island and open sea, a place that was land without being quite land in the established sense. Hera's decree had forbidden solid ground, land that received the sun's light, established earth. Delos, floating or drifting, neither quite anchored nor quite fixed, existed at the edge of that category. It was not clearly within the terms of the prohibition, or perhaps Delos was simply willing to take the risk. The mythology gives the island a voice. Delos spoke to Leto. Delos said, "I am small and rocky and poor, and no one has wanted to establish themselves here. I have nothing to offer anyone, but I will take you. I will be your resting place. And in return, if the child you bear becomes as great as you say, he will honor me and make this rock famous beyond any island in the sea." Leto agreed. She came to Delos. She lay down on the rocky ground of the island, and she gave birth. Artemis came first. The mythology presents this in a specific way. Artemis was born first, and then immediately assisted with the birth of her twin brother. Even as a newborn, even in the first moments of her own existence, Artemis was already in the role that would define her, the role of the helper of women in childbirth. The midwife goddess, born herself and immediately midwifing, the divine capacity for that specific kind of assistance present from the very first moment of her life. This detail is theologically precise. Artemis governed childbirth alongside Eileithyia, the daughter of Hera, who was specifically the goddess of labor and delivery. Women in difficult labors prayed to Artemis. Women who survived difficult childbirths made offerings to Artemis. The goddess of the hunt, the wild places, the moon, was also the goddess who presided over the most intimate and most dangerous experience of the female body. The connection was not arbitrary. The wild things gave birth in the wild. Artemis, who governed the wild and its creatures, governed the moment of birth that all creatures, wild and domesticated, experienced. She emerged into the world with the qualities already in her. The independence, the connection to the natural world, the specific form of freedom that came from choosing the wild over the civilized. She was immediately fully herself. Then Apollo. The birth of Apollo was attended by signs that the mythology describes with the specific vocabulary of divine arrival. The island of Delos, which had been poor and rocky and unremarkable, was flooded with golden light at the moment of his birth. The ground that had been bare rock burst into flowers. The swans that were sacred to him, the white birds of the clear northern skies, circled the island 7 times. 7, the number associated with Apollo throughout his mythology, completing their circuits around the point where the god of light and truth had just arrived in the world. He announced himself. Even as a newborn, he announced himself, in the way that divine beings of his particular quality announce themselves, not with words, but with presence, with the specific quality of light and clarity that was his essential nature, radiating from him in those first moments as it would radiate for the rest of the mythology. The goddesses who attended the birth, who had come to Delos in defiance of Hera's decree because what was happening on that floating island was too significant to stay away from, washed him and wrapped him in white cloth. They fed him nectar and ambrosia, the divine food. And Apollo, who had been in the world for perhaps an hour, untied his swaddling cloths and stood up. He was not a baby in the way that mortal babies were babies. He was the god of the sun and of truth and of music and of prophecy, and the pretense of helplessness that newborns required was not available to a being of his nature. He stood up. He spoke. He declared himself. He said that he would reveal the will of Zeus to mortals, that he would speak truth, that his prophecy would not be hidden or ambiguous, but would be the direct communication of divine truth to those who sought it. This declaration, made in the first hour of his existence, defined his role in the mythology for everything that followed. Apollo was the god of truth, not a god who sometimes told the truth or who valued truth among other things. The god whose essential nature was the alignment between what was and what was said about what was. His oracle at Delphi, which he would establish at the site where the Omphalos stone had fallen when Kronos disgorged it, would be the most consulted oracle in the ancient world for centuries precisely because Apollo's truth was understood to be real truth. The words spoken through his priestess were not comfortable words, not words designed to please the questioner, but words that reflected what was actually going to happen. Apollo's domains were multiple and seemingly diverse, but they were unified by the same underlying quality that expressed itself in different registers. He was the god of the sun, not simply the sun as an astronomical body, that role belonging to Helios. Apollo was the sun as a symbol of illumination, of the light that revealed things, that made things visible that darkness had concealed. The sun that made it possible to see what was actually there rather than what you imagined in the dark. This illuminating quality was present in everything Apollo governed. He was the god of music. The lyre was his instrument, and he played it with a mastery that had no equal. Music was another form of the illuminating quality. Music expressed what could not be said in ordinary language. It made audible something that was otherwise inexpressible. It revealed the emotional truth of situations that reason could not fully articulate. Apollo's music was not entertainment. It was revelation, the kind that changed you in the hearing. He was the god of prophecy. The oracle at Delphi, where he spoke through the Pythia, his priestess, was the intersection of all his qualities. Truth, light, the revelation of what was hidden. The oracle spoke in riddles not because Apollo was evasive, but because truth, when it was genuinely true, resisted the simplification that direct statement required. The oracle said what was, and what was had a complexity that direct answers could not capture. He was the god of healing and of plague. This combination of opposites was again expressing the same underlying quality. Light healed. Light also burned. Truth was medicinal when received and devastating when rejected. Apollo's arrows brought plague when he was angered. Apollo's arts cured disease when he was propitiated. The same divine quality, expressed as healing or as destruction depending on the relationship between the god and the person affected. He was also the god of reason and of law and of civilization in its most ordered and most rational expression. The civilizing principle, the force that transformed chaos into order, wildness into governance, the raw into the refined. In this, he was the perfect counterpart to his twin sister Artemis, who governed the wild places that civilization had not yet reached. Artemis was the goddess of the hunt, the moon, the wild places, and the protection of young girls and women. She was as independent as Athena, but expressed that independence differently. Where Athena was the intelligence of the city, the wisdom that governed the built world, Artemis was the intelligence of the wilderness, the wisdom that governed the unbuilt world. The forests and the mountains and the uncultivated spaces where the rules of civilization did not apply and the skills of civilization were not useful. She hunted. not for sport in the modern recreational sense, but in the ancient sense of the skilled pursuit of animals in their own environment, requiring knowledge of terrain and weather and animal behavior, requiring patience and precision, requiring the specific kind of intelligence that the wilderness demanded. She was the divine hunter, the mistress of the chase, and her arrows were as accurate as her brothers and far more frequently deployed against living things. She was the goddess of the moon in its specific aspect as the light that made night navigation possible. Her silver arrows were the silver light of the moon. Her domain at night was the same domain that her brother held during the day. The twin gods of light, one solar and one lunar, one the light of reason and civilization, and the other the light of the wild night. She was fierce in the protection of her virginity. Men who violated the sanctity of the wild places she governed, who stumbled upon her bathing or who attempted to approach her sexually, suffered consequences that the mythology records in detail. Actaeon, who saw her bathing in a woodland pool and was seen by her, was transformed into a stag and then torn apart by his own hunting dogs. Orion, the great hunter who came too close, died under circumstances that the different versions of the mythology attribute variously to a scorpion, to Apollo who did not want his sister distracted, or to Artemis herself. The goddess of the wild places guarded her autonomy with the same ruthlessness that the wild itself displayed. Apollo kept his word to Delos, the island that had sheltered his mother when every other land turned away became the most sacred island in the Greek world. Delos became a religious center of extraordinary importance. No one could be born or die on the island. The sick and the pregnant were transported to the nearby island of Rhea when their time came. The island of Delos remained pure, the birthplace of the god, touched by his presence in a way that the ordinary processes of mortality were not permitted to contaminate. The great sanctuary of Apollo at Delos attracted pilgrims from across the Greek world. The festivals held there drew visitors from every island and every coastal city. The treasury of the Delian League, the alliance that Athens led against Persia, was kept there because the island's sacred status provided a security that no fortification could match. The floating island was anchored by the birth that had happened there, by the golden light that had flooded it in that moment, by the swans that had circled it 7 times, by the promise that had been made and kept between a homeless goddess in labor and a rocky island that had nothing to offer except willingness. The island offered willingness. The god honored the island. And the twins who had been born there, Apollo and Artemis, went out into the world that had refused to receive them and became 2 of the most important divine presences in it. 2 expressions of light, one of day and one of night, one of the city and one of the wild, one of reason and one of instinct. Together, the complete arc of illuminated existence, from the first light of dawn to the last light of the moon before the dark returned, born together on a floating island, gifts to a world that had not known it needed them. Maia lived alone, on Mount Cyllene in Arcadia, in a deep cave in the mountain. The nymph Maia had made her home. She was one of the Pleiades, the 7 daughters of the Titan Atlas and the Oceanid Pleion, 7 sisters, transformed eventually into the star cluster that the Greeks watched rising and setting to mark the agricultural seasons. Maia was the eldest and the most beautiful of the 7. She had chosen solitude, not out of misanthropy, not out of any particular grief or trauma, but out of the specific temperament of someone who finds the company of the world more exhausting than the company of their own thoughts. She lived in her cave on the mountain, and she kept to herself, and she was, by the standards of the mythology, unusually quiet. Zeus found her. Zeus always found the beings he was interested in. The king of the gods, who could see everything from the sky, who had access to every part of the world, was not constrained in his pursuit by geography or by obscurity. Maia's cave on Mount Cyllene was not hidden from Zeus. Nothing was hidden from Zeus except the things that Gaia specifically concealed, and Maia had not asked Gaia for concealment. He came to her in the night, while Hera slept, or while Hera was occupied elsewhere, while the queen of the gods was not in a position to observe what her husband was doing. He came to the cave on Mount Cyllene, and he came to Maia, and 9 months later, in that same cave, in that same solitude, the child was born. Hermes. Hermes was born at dawn. This is a specific detail, and it matters. Dawn was the threshold, the moment between night and day, between the sleeping world and the waking world, between the time when things were hidden and the time when they were revealed. The birth at dawn established from the first moment that this god was a being of thresholds, of transitions, of the spaces between categories where the ordinary rules did not quite apply. He was not a child for long, or rather, he was a child for the duration of a single day. And in that single day, he accomplished things that established every aspect of his divine character so thoroughly that the mythology could simply point to them and say, "This is who Hermes is." He was wrapped in swaddling cloths. He lay in his cradle in the cave on Mount Cyllene. He was a newborn, in all the apparent helplessness that newborns presented. He got up and walked out of the cave. He walked to Pieria, in Macedonia, where the cattle of the gods grazed. The divine herd, animals of extraordinary quality, tended by Helios and sacred to the gods. He found 50 of them. He looked at them with the eyes of a being who had been in the world for less than a day and who already understood exactly how things worked and what you could get away with if you were clever about how you did it. He stole them. He drove them backward. He made them walk backward, hoofprints pointing away from the direction of travel, so that anyone who tried to follow the tracks would be going in the wrong direction. He tied brush to their tails to obscure the tracks further. He made himself special sandals from branches and leaves that left no recognizable footprints. And he drove 50 divine cattle through the night from Pieria to Pylos, on the southwestern coast of the Peloponnese, covering an enormous distance in a single night. At Pylos, he sacrificed 2 of the cattle. He divided the meat into 12 portions, 1 for each of the Olympians, including himself. This was itself a statement. He was counting himself among the Olympians. He was, by the act of making the sacrifice in 12 portions, asserting his place at the divine table before he had been invited to it. Then he hid the remaining cattle in a cave and went back to Mount Cyllene. He slipped back into his swaddling cloths. He lay in his cradle with the expression of a newborn who had not moved at all during the night. He was less than 1 day old. On the way back from Pieria to his cave, Hermes had found a tortoise. He looked at the tortoise with the same eyes that had assessed the divine cattle and understood their value. He picked it up. He carried it home. And there, in the cave, he killed the tortoise and used its shell as the body of a new instrument. He stretched strings across the shell. 7 strings, the number that would become canonical for the lyre. He plucked them. He listened to what they produced. He adjusted. He played. He invented the lyre. On the first day of his existence, the god who would become the patron of music, among many other things, invented the primary instrument of Greek musical culture. The instrument that Apollo would eventually play with unmatched mastery was first made by Hermes in a cave on Mount Cyllene on the day he was born. This is characteristic of Hermes in the mythology. He does not receive his attributes from other gods. He creates them. He finds the materials in the world around him, the tortoise shell, the strings, and he makes something that had not existed before. The inventor, not just the practitioner. He played the lyre and he sang. The first song was about the love of Zeus and Maya, about his own birth, about the world as he had experienced it in one extraordinary day. The song was, by the account of the Homeric hymn to Hermes, astonishingly beautiful. The cave on Mount Cyllene was filled with music that had never existed before, played on an instrument that had never existed before, by a god who had been born that morning. Apollo found out about the cattle. He was the god of truth. He was also Helios's descendant and the divine presence most closely associated with the divine herd that Hermes had stolen. He was not going to overlook this. He went to Maya's cave. He arrived with the confident indignation of a divine being who had been robbed and who expected the guilty party to answer for it. He demanded the cattle back. He found a baby in a cradle. The baby looked at him with enormous innocent eyes. The baby knew nothing about any cattle. The baby had been right here all night, sleeping in its swaddling cloths, doing nothing at all. Ask anyone. Apollo was not fooled. He was the god of truth, and he could see, with the specific perception that truth gave him, that the baby in the cradle was not what it appeared to be. He knew what had happened. He had found the tracks, or the absence of tracks, which in its own way was more suspicious than tracks. He had followed the evidence. He knew this baby had taken his cattle. The baby continued to be innocent. Apollo took the matter to Zeus. Zeus was, by the account of the Homeric hymn, delighted. He looked at this extraordinary child who had accomplished more in one day than most gods accomplished in a generation. He saw in Hermes something that he recognized, perhaps, from his own hidden childhood. The intelligence that found ways through situations that direct force could not address. The cleverness that was not just a secondary quality, but a primary one. He ordered Hermes to return the cattle. Hermes led Apollo to Pylos. He showed him the hidden cattle. And then, as a gesture of conciliation, as the specific kind of gift that a being who understood value offered when he needed to repair a relationship, he brought out the lyre and he played it for Apollo. Apollo heard the music, and everything changed. Apollo, who was the god of music in its most accomplished and most beautiful expression, heard music that was new, an instrument he had never heard before, playing melodies that had never existed before, played by a being who had made them up on the first day of his existence. Apollo listened, and he felt what beauty felt like when it arrived unexpectedly from a direction you had not been looking. He forgot about the cattle entirely. He wanted the lyre. Hermes gave him the lyre. In exchange, Apollo gave Hermes the cattle. The god of truth and music, who had arrived to demand the return of stolen property, left having traded his entire herd for a tortoiseshell instrument. And he was satisfied with the trade. More than satisfied, he was transformed by it. The transaction established the relationship between the two gods that would persist through the mythology. Apollo and Hermes, the god of truth and the god of cleverness, the god of high art and the god of invention, bound together by the exchange that had originated in a theft and been resolved by music. Hermes was the messenger of the gods. This was his official role in the divine hierarchy, the function that the divine community assigned to him when he was eventually admitted to Olympus, which happened as a direct consequence of the cattle incident and Zeus's recognition of his qualities. He was the messenger, the one who traveled between the divine world and the mortal world carrying the communications of the gods. He wore winged sandals, a gift from Zeus or a development of the sandals he had improvised from branches on his first night in the world. He carried the caduceus, the herald's staff entwined with two serpents, the symbol of his role as divine messenger. But his role was much larger than simple messenger. He was the god of all the activities that required the qualities he had demonstrated on his first day in the world. He was the god of travelers and of roads, the god of all those who move through the world on their way between one place and another. Hermes, stone pillars with his face and a phallus, were placed at crossroads throughout Greece, both as markers and as divine protection for travelers. To be on the road was to be in Hermes' domain. He was the god of thieves and of commerce. The same intelligence that had taken 50 divine cattle and hidden them so cleverly that even Apollo had trouble finding them was the intelligence that drove commerce. Trade was, in a certain light, a sophisticated form of taking what you needed through means that did not involve direct force. The negotiation of exchange, the understanding of value, the recognition of what one thing was worth against another. These were the skills of the merchant and the skills of the clever thief, and they were both under Hermes' patronage. He was the god of communication and of language. The messenger carried words. The inventor of the lyre had found a way to communicate something that ordinary words could not reach. Hermes governed the full range of communication, from the simple message to the most complex forms of expression that language could achieve. He was the psychopomp, the guide of souls. When mortals died, it was Hermes who came to escort them from the world of the living to the world of the dead. This role connected everything else about him. The traveler on the road between worlds. The one who crossed boundaries that others could not cross. The being of thresholds who had been born at the threshold of dawn, who moved between day and night, between divine and mortal, between living and dead, as easily as other beings moved within a single domain. He was the only Olympian who could move freely in all three realms. The sky, where Zeus governed. The sea, where Poseidon governed. The underworld, where Hades governed. Hermes moved through all of them. He brought messages to Hades. He escorted souls into the underworld and, on rare occasions, brought them back out. He traveled to the bottom of the sea. He flew through the sky. He moved across the surface of the earth in both directions. No boundary held him. No threshold stopped him. He had been born at dawn, and he had spent the first day of his life establishing this quality in everything he did. The theft that crossed the boundary between what was his and what was not his. The invention that crossed the boundary between noise and music. The transaction that crossed the boundary between conflict and alliance. Hermes, the god of the in-between, the god of everything that happened at the crossing of one thing to another, the god who made it possible for the divine world and the mortal world to communicate, for the living to know what the dead had to say, for messages to cross any distance between any points in the universe. Born in a cave on a mountain in Arcadia, on the first day of his life, he stole 50 divine cattle and invented the lyre. What the rest of his days produced, the mythology records in abundance. Aphrodite had been in the world since before the Titanomachy. She had been born from the sea foam at the moment Kronos struck Uranus, at the first great wound in the history of the divine world, at the moment that everything that followed had been set in motion. She had stepped ashore on Cyprus while the world was still in the age of the Titans, while Kronos was still ruling from his golden throne. while the 6 Olympians who would eventually govern the world were still either swallowed or hidden. She was older than the Olympian order. She predated it. She had existed in the world while Zeus was growing up on Crete, while the war was being fought, while the Titans were being bound and sent to Tartarus. She had been present and active in the world throughout all of that, because love and desire did not pause for the convenience of divine politics. And now, with the Olympian order established and the 12 thrones prepared on the newly built Olympus, the question of where Aphrodite fit in this new arrangement required an answer. The mythology handles Aphrodite's admission to Olympus differently from the admission of the other gods. The others were born into it or arrived through a specific birth story that placed them clearly in the divine hierarchy. Apollo and Artemis were the children of Zeus and Leto, born on Delos, and their place in the Olympian order was established by the fact of their parentage. Hermes was the child of Zeus and Maia, and the cattle incident had made his nature clear enough that Zeus had simply brought him into the divine community. Athena had emerged from Zeus's head, but Aphrodite had emerged from the sea foam before any of this. She was nobody's daughter in the Olympian sense. She was the daughter of Uranus's blood and the sea's response to it. She was older than the divine order she was being asked to join. She walked in from the sea. The mythology describes her arrival at Olympus with the same quality that characterized everything about her. Not humble and not aggressive, simply present with the full force of what she was. The goddess of love and desire and beauty, arriving at the home of the gods with the quality of her presence preceding her, filling the space before she entered it, making the gods who were already there aware of her before they had consciously registered her arrival. The Graces attended her. The Ori, the goddesses of the seasons and of the orderly progression of time, dressed her. The mythology gives us the detail of her arrival with a specific kind of care, as if the moment deserved to be described precisely because it was the moment that one of the most fundamental forces in the universe took her official place at the divine table. Zeus accepted her. This acceptance had its own complexity. Zeus was attracted to Aphrodite. The mythology records this without embarrassment. The king of gods, who was attracted to every beautiful being in creation, was attracted to the goddess of beauty herself. He wanted her for himself. But there was a complication. There were multiple complications. Zeus gave Aphrodite to Hephaestus in marriage. The reasoning behind this decision was not entirely clear to the other gods at the time and has not been entirely clear to commentators since. One interpretation was that Zeus was being deliberately ironic or deliberately protective of the divine community's stability by pairing the most beautiful goddess with the least conventionally attractive god. Another interpretation was that he was providing Hephaestus with compensation for his difficult birth and his difficult relationship with Hera. Another was that he was trying to keep Aphrodite off the market, so to speak, to prevent her from becoming the center of conflict among the male gods who would all want her. None of these interpretations fully explains it. What the mythology offers instead of explanation is the result, which is one of the most famous mismatches in the divine world. Hephaestus was the craftsman. He was lame. He was not conventionally beautiful. He lived in his forge, surrounded by his work, absorbed in the making of extraordinary things. His world was the world of craft, of material transformation, of the satisfaction that came from taking raw materials and making them into something that exceeded their origins. Aphrodite was the goddess of love and beauty and desire. She was not interested in craft for its own sake. She was not interested in the slow satisfaction of making things. She was interested in the immediate, overwhelming, irrational force of attraction that she embodied and that constituted her entire nature. They were not compatible. This was obvious to everyone, including them. But the marriage was arranged by Zeus, and it stood in the specific way that divine arrangement stood, not because both parties were happy with it, but because the authority behind it was sufficient to establish it as the official state of affairs. Aphrodite took a lover. The lover was Ares, the god of war, not the craftsman, not the patient maker, the violent, beautiful, radiant god of combat, whose quality was the exact opposite of Hephaestus's quality, who embodied everything that Hephaestus did not embody. Where Hephaestus was patience, Ares was immediacy. Where Hephaestus was making, Ares was destroying. Where Hephaestus's beauty was in his work, Ares's beauty was in himself. Love chose war over craft. Desire chose the violent and the beautiful over the patient and the skilled. This was not a surprise to anyone except perhaps Hephaestus. And it was a specific kind of surprise for Hephaestus, the craftsman, who responded to it with the most craftsman-like revenge in the mythology. Helios told him, the sun god, who saw everything, who had witnessed the affair from his daily crossing of the sky, came to Hephaestus and told him what was happening in his own bed. The information arrived as information tends to arrive when it is information you did not want, with a specific weight that it did not have when it was still just suspicion. Hephaestus went to his forge. He made a net, not an ordinary net, an adamantine net, made from links so fine they were nearly invisible, so strong they could not be broken, so precisely engineered that it could be spread across a bed and folded back and held in place by mechanisms that were invisible to anyone who did not know they were there. A craftsman's revenge. The most elegant, the most specific, the most theatrical revenge available to someone whose particular genius was making things that did the work he needed done. He announced that he was going to Lemnos. He made a show of preparing to leave. He left. Ares arrived. He came to the palace on Olympus where Hephaestus and Aphrodite shared their official home. He found Aphrodite. They went to bed. The net closed. They were caught in it, Ares and Aphrodite, trapped in the adamantine web that Hephaestus had made and left and waited for them to activate. They could not break it. The god of war, with all his force, could not break the net that the craftsman had made specifically to hold him. The goddess of love and desire, with all her divine power, could not slip out of the links that had been made to be inescapable. They lay there caught, and Hephaestus came home. He did not simply free them. That would have been insufficient. He was the god who made things, and what he had made this time was not just a trap, but a public statement. He called the gods to witness what he had found. He invited the divine community to come and see the god of war and the goddess of love, caught in an adamantine net in the bed of the divine smith. The gods came, and they laughed. This is one of the most memorable details of the story, the laughter of the divine community at the spectacle of Ares trapped by Hephaestus. The powerful brought low by the clever, the beautiful and the violent, caught by the patient and the skilled. The mythology's most pointed illustration of the limits of force when it encountered craft deployed with full intelligence. The goddesses stayed away. The mythology notes this with the specific precision of someone who understood that women watching other women humiliated was not the same thing as men finding other men funny. The goddesses had more complicated feelings about what they were seeing. Eventually, Hephaestus was persuaded to release them. Poseidon interceded, promising to pay whatever fine was appropriate if Ares defaulted. The net was loosened. Ares went to Thrace, his homeland. Aphrodite went to Cyprus, to the sacred island of her birth, to restore herself with sea bathing and the attentions of the Graces. The marriage of Hephaestus and Aphrodite continued, officially, in name, as the divine arrangement that Zeus had established persisted because divine arrangements did not simply dissolve when the parties involved found them inconvenient. Aphrodite took her throne on Olympus, the 12th throne, or one of the 12, in the great hall that Hephaestus had built. The goddess who was older than the Olympian order, who had been born before Zeus was born, who had been present in the world throughout the Titanomachy, while the gods who now governed it were still imprisoned or hidden, finally had her official place. Her domain was everything that desire touched, which was, as the mythology consistently demonstrated, everything. The love affairs of gods and mortals. The desire that caused Zeus to pursue Maia and Leto and Alcmene and all the others. The attraction that brought mortals together in the unions that produced the heroes. The beauty that launched ships, as a later poet would say, thinking of Helen and the Trojan War and the chain of events that Aphrodite had set in motion by offering Helen to Paris as a prize. She was powerful in a way that the other gods sometimes misunderstood because her power did not express itself as direct force. She did not throw lightning bolts. She did not shake the earth. She did not govern with the visible authority of a ruler or the obvious force of a warrior. She simply made things desired. She made beings want other beings. She made beauty a force that overrode reason, that bypassed strategy, that made the most careful and the most rational beings do things they would not otherwise do. In the Iliad, she is wounded by the mortal Diomedes with Athena's assistance, and she cries and flees to Zeus, who comforts her and tells her that warfare is not her domain, that she should leave fighting to Ares and Athena. This seems, at first, to diminish her, the goddess who cries when she is cut and who is told to stay out of battles. But the Iliad is a story that was caused by Aphrodite. The whole war, 10 years of the most catastrophic conflict in the mythology, was the consequence of a choice Aphrodite made when she offered Paris the most beautiful woman in the world. No wound that Diomedes inflicted on her in battle compared to what she had inflicted on the world by doing what she was the goddess of. She made people want things. Terribly. Beyond reason. Beyond self-preservation. Beyond any calculation of cost and consequence. And they got what they wanted. And the consequences were what they were. That was Aphrodite. That was her place in the Olympian order. Not on the battlefield, but at the origin of everything that led to the battlefield. She sat on her throne. She received her worship from everyone who wanted to be loved, which was everyone. She governed the force that the mythology had placed at the beginning of creation, in the primordial Eros, who was the reason anything combined with anything. Love had been present since the second generation of existence. It was present still. It would be present when everything else had changed. Aphrodite, born from the sea foam, seated on her throne, was the oldest divine force wearing the newest divine title. And she was not finished. She was, in fact, just beginning. The story of Hephaestus begins with a fall, or perhaps two falls. The mythology is not consistent about which fall came first, or whether there was one fall or two, or who threw him and when. The ancient sources disagree in ways that suggest the story existed in multiple regional traditions before it was written down, each tradition emphasizing different aspects, each preserving a different memory of the same essential event. What all the sources agree on is this: Hephaestus fell from Olympus to the earth below. He fell an enormous distance, and the fall changed him permanently. Let us sit with the two versions, because both of them are important and both of them say something true about who Hephaestus was and what his relationship to the divine community actually looked like. In the first version, Hera threw him. She had given birth to him alone. In the tradition that says Hephaestus was Hera's solo production, made without Zeus as a response to Zeus's production of Athena without her. She had made him to prove that she could make what Zeus could make, to demonstrate that the creative power was not exclusively his. And then she looked at what she had made. He was lame, or he had some physical imperfection that the mythology describes differently in different sources, but that consistently amounts to a departure from the divine standard of physical perfection. The gods were supposed to be beautiful. They were supposed to embody the ideal forms of what they were. Hera, who was proud, who had the specific quality of knowing exactly what was and was not worthy of her, looked at this child she had made, the child who was supposed to be her answer to Zeus's Athena, and she felt something that the mythology does not name, but that is unmistakable. She was ashamed. She took the infant Hephaestus and she threw him off Olympus. He fell. He fell for a day. The mythology is specific about this duration, a full day of falling from the divine heights above the clouds to the earth below. What that fall felt like, what an infant experiences when it falls for a day from a divine height, the mythology does not say. What it says is that he landed in the sea near the island of Lemnos, where the sea nymphs caught him, or where the Sintis, the inhabitants of the island, found him and took him in. He was injured by the fall. His lameness, in this version, was the result of the impact. The legs that could not be healed by any divine medicine because the injury had been done by a fall from the divine heights, and some injuries, once incurred, persist regardless of the power brought to bear against them. He grew up on Lemnos, away from Olympus, away from the divine community, away from the mother who had thrown him and the father who had not claimed him. He grew up with mortals, or with the particular semi-divine inhabitants of Lemnos who were known for their metalworking tradition. And he learned to forge. He learned in the conditions of the outside world, with the materials available to a craftsman on a volcanic island in the Aegean. Lemnos had its own tradition of metalworking, its own forged fires, its own understanding of what metal could be made to do. And Hephaestus, who was a god, who had the specific divine gift for craft that was his essential nature, took the materials and traditions of Lemnos and learned them and went beyond them. He became the greatest craftsman who had ever lived. In exile from the divine home, rejected by the mother who had made him, learning his craft in the conditions of the world below rather than the world above. And then he came back, with the golden throne. He sent it to Hera as a gift. The most beautiful throne in creation, made with the full power of his divine craft, made to be the perfect seat for the queen of the gods. She received it. She sat on it, and the invisible chains closed. The queen of the gods, trapped on her own throne by the sun she had thrown off a mountain. The gods pleaded. Hermes went to him. Ares went to him with threats of force that Hephaestus declined to be impressed by. Eventually Dionysus got him drunk and brought him back to Olympus. He released Hera. The condition of his return, or the gift given to secure it, was Aphrodite. The lame craftsman, the rejected son, returned to the divine community not as a supplicant, but as a being who had demonstrated that his craft could do something that none of the other gods could undo. In the second version, it was Zeus who threw him. Hephaestus was already on Olympus in this version. He was the legitimate son of Zeus and Hera, born within the marriage, a recognized member of the divine community. He had taken his mother's side in a quarrel between Hera and Zeus, which was a dangerous position to take, as any quarrel between Zeus and Hera was essentially a quarrel between the two most powerful forces in the divine world, and the space for a third party to take a side was a space that closed very suddenly when the quarrel resolved. Zeus was angry with Hera for something. Different sources give different causes. The tormenting of Heracles is one possibility. Hera had been pursuing Heracles with a relentless and comprehensive hostility that Zeus found excessive and that he had told her to stop. She had not stopped. Zeus, in his fury, had hung her from the sky by golden chains, with anvils attached to her feet as punishment. Hephaestus saw this and could not accept it. He intervened. He untied his mother. Zeus turned his anger on Hephaestus. He seized the craftsman by the foot, or the ankle, or the leg, and he threw him. The king of gods, with the full force that had thrown lightning bolts across the plain of Thessaly in the Titanomachy, threw his son off Olympus. Hephaestus fell all day, the same duration, the same enormous distance, the same fall. He landed on Lemnos. The impact broke his legs, or one leg, or both, in ways that could not be fully healed afterward. The fall made him lame. In this version, the lameness was not there from birth. It was a wound, a specific, datable wound caused by a specific act by a specific being. Zeus threw him, and the fall broke him, and nothing afterward could fully repair the damage. The craftsman who would build Olympus and forge the weapons of the gods and make the extraordinary objects that the mythology attributed to him was a craftsman who worked with broken legs, who moved through the divine forge with the specific gait that the fall had given him, who had been thrown by the most powerful being in existence and had survived the throw. Wherever the fall happened and whoever caused it, what came after was the forge. Hephaestus had his divine forge, located under a volcano, or under the ocean near Lemnos, or on the island itself. The specific geography varied, but the essential description was consistent. A place of fire and metal and the specific conditions that divine craftsmanship required. Heat beyond what mortal forges could achieve. Materials beyond what mortal minds could provide. The volcanic fire of the deep earth, which was Tartarian fire, the fire that had been burning since before the world was fully formed. He had assistants, the Cyclopes, Brontes and Steripes and Argesh, who had been freed from Tartarus by Zeus, and who sometimes worked alongside him in the divine forge. They were the original master craftsmen, the beings who had made the first weapons of the divine age, and their collaboration with Hephaestus produced the most extraordinary objects in the mythology. He also had mechanical servants. The mythology describes golden women who assisted him in his forge, beings made entirely of metal who moved and worked as if they were alive. They had understanding and speech and strength, the qualities of intelligence and communication and capability, but they were made of gold, shaped by his hands, animated by his divine craft. These were the first automata in the mythology, the first mechanical beings. Hephaestus had made what we would call robots, thousands of years before the word existed, because the divine craftsman's imagination had no practical limits. What he made in that forge constitutes one of the most impressive catalogs in the mythology. The armor of Achilles. When Thetis, the sea nymph who was Achilles' mother, came to him and asked for divine armor for her son who was about to return to the war at Troy, Hephaestus made it. The shield alone, described by Homer in the Iliad in a passage that has been read and studied for millennia, was a cosmic object. On it were depicted the earth and the heavens and the sea. Two cities, one at peace and one at war. Fields being plowed and harvested. Vineyards being gathered. A herd of cattle. A dance. The river Oceanus running around the rim. The entire world rendered in divine metalwork on a single shield. The necklace of Harmonia. When Harmonia, the daughter of Ares and Aphrodite, was married to the mortal Cadmus, Hephaestus made her a wedding gift. A golden necklace of extraordinary beauty. It was also cursed, or perhaps simply consequential in the way that divine objects were consequential, carrying within it the accumulated weight of the circumstances of its making. Harmonia's necklace passed through the mythology, leaving disaster in its wake, possessed by those who possessed it and dragging them toward the specific fates that the necklace seemed to draw toward it. The golden throne that caught Hera, the net that caught Ares and Aphrodite, the chains that bound Prometheus to his rock, the palace of the gods on Olympus, the divine furnishings of the divine world, the scepter of Zeus, objects so numerous and so varied that the catalog of what Hephaestus made is itself a kind of mythology, a parallel text to the stories of what gods did and what heroes accomplished. Hephaestus was the god who demonstrated that the most valuable thing in the divine world was not beauty or force or authority, but skill. He was not beautiful. He was not fast or graceful or the kind of presence that filled a room with effortless magnificence. He moved with a limp. He spent his time in a forge rather than on Olympus. He was, by the superficial standards that the divine community applied to itself, not impressive. And yet the other gods needed him more than they needed almost anyone else. They needed his forge. They needed his craft. They needed the objects he could make that no one else could make, that only the divine craftsman with his specific gift and his specific knowledge and his specific relationship to material and fire and the making of things could produce. The armor that protected Achilles, the net that caught Ares, the throne that proved to Hera that her son was not to be dismissed. All of it made by the god who had been thrown off a mountain. The mythology was saying something that the ancient Greeks took seriously and that deserves to be taken seriously still. The craftsman is essential. The maker is essential. The person who works with their hands to produce the things that everyone else depends on is not diminished by that work. The lame god who built Olympus was as important to the divine order as the sky god who governed it. Hephaestus sat at his forge, and he made what was needed, and the world was better for what he made. He had been thrown from the heights, and he had survived the fall, and he had come back with craft that no fall could damage. The divine community had laughed at Ares and Aphrodite caught in his net. Nobody laughed at Hephaestus. The craftsman had the last word, as craftsmen always do. They make the thing that lasts after the strength is gone and the beauty has faded. He made things that lasted. Semele was a mortal woman, the daughter of Cadmus, the founder of Thebes, and Harmonia, the daughter of Ares and Aphrodite. She was, through her mother, the grandchild of two Olympians. Not divine herself, not immortal, not protected by the specific invulnerability that divine nature provided, but connected to the divine world through her lineage in ways that made the divine world more accessible to her and more present in her life than it was for ordinary mortals. Zeus saw her and fell in love with her, or felt what Zeus felt for the beings he pursued, which the mythology consistently calls love, but which expressed itself in ways that the loved being did not always experience as love. He came to her. He came as himself, in his full divine form, to begin with, but that was immediately impossible. The full presence of Zeus, the king of gods in his complete divine expression, was something mortal eyes could not contain. He came instead in human disguise, as he came to most of his mortal loves. As a man, as something Semele could see and touch and speak to and love in the ordinary human way. They were together, and Semele became pregnant. Hera knew. She always knew. And this time her response was not the pursuit of the lover or the persecution of the future child. This time Hera was more subtle, more devastating, more precisely aimed at the specific vulnerability that the situation provided. She disguised herself as an old woman, a neighbor of Semele's, a familiar, comfortable presence, the kind of elderly woman who visited and talked and gave advice. Hera in this disguise visited Semele and asked about her lover. Semele told her. She was proud of it. Her lover was divine. He was extraordinary. He was not like any mortal man she had ever known. And Hera, the neighbor, the old woman, the careful friend, asked the question that she knew would do the work she needed it to do. If he is truly a god, she said, why does he not come to you as a god? Why does he take a mortal form? Perhaps he is not what he claims. Perhaps he is simply a man who has told you a flattering story. If he truly is Zeus, ask him to prove it. Ask him to come to you as he comes to Hera, as he comes to his divine wife, in his full divine form, without disguise, without the concession to your mortal limitations. If he loves you, he will not refuse. Semele heard this and felt the doubt that Hera had placed in her. And when Zeus came to her next, she made him swear. She asked him to swear by the Styx, the most binding oath in creation, the oath that even the gods could not break, that he would grant her any wish she asked. Zeus swore, and Semele asked to see him in his full divine form. Zeus understood immediately what had happened. He understood who had put this idea in her head. He understood what the consequence would be. He tried to talk her out of it. He suggested other wishes. He offered alternatives. He did everything that the oath allowed him to do short of refusing entirely. She insisted. He had sworn by the Styx. He could not refuse. He came to her as himself, Zeus, the king of gods, in his full divine form, with his lightning and his thunder and the overwhelming quality of divine presence that was simply incompatible with mortal existence. The same quality that had made it impossible for him to come to her as himself in the first place. The quality that mortal eyes were not made to receive. Semele looked at him and was consumed. The lightning burned her, not as a weapon, not as an act of violence, not as a punishment, simply as the consequence of what she had asked for. The full divine presence of the King of Gods was a form of energy that mortal bodies could not contain. She was burned from within by what she had insisted on seeing. She died, but she was pregnant. The child was real, divine, not yet born, still developing. And the child was in the burning. And Zeus did what a god could do that no mortal could do. He took the unborn child, the divine infant who was not yet ready for the world, and he placed it in his own thigh. He sewed the opening closed. He carried the child himself, in his own body, for the remaining months until the birth. The child of Zeus and Semele gestated in the thigh of Zeus, born of a mortal mother who had burned in the light of his divine father, completed in the divine body that was the only body available to contain him. Twice born, the mythology called him Dionysus, the twice-born god. When the time was right, Zeus opened his thigh and Dionysus was born, not from Olympus, not in a divine setting attended by the gods. From the body of Zeus himself, on the mountain or wherever Zeus was when the time came, into a world that did not yet know what to do with what had arrived in it. Zeus gave the infant to Hermes, the messenger god, the god of boundaries and crossings and the in-between, carried the newborn Dionysus to safety, to hide him from Hera, who had already demonstrated what she did with the children of Zeus's affairs with others, to Ino and Artemis, the mortal relatives of Semele. He dressed the infant as a girl to confuse Hera's surveillance. Hera found out and drove Ino and Artemis to madness. They killed their own children in their madness. The infant Dionysus had to be moved again. He was given to the nymphs of Nyssa, a group of nymphs in a place that the mythology located variously in different ancient accounts, in Asia Minor, in Libya, in India, or in some cases in a mythological geography that was not quite anywhere specific. Nyssa was the place of Dionysus's upbringing, wherever it was. The nymphs cared for him and raised him and kept him hidden from Hera while he grew. Zeus transformed him into a kid, a young goat, to hide his divine nature from Hera's awareness. This is one of the mythology's quieter ironies. The god who would be most associated with the wildness of animals and the boundary dissolution that animal transformation represented was himself transformed into an animal in infancy to keep him safe. He grew up wild, in the company of nymphs in a landscape that was somewhere outside the ordinary world, outside the governing structure of Olympus, outside the ordered divine hierarchy. He was not raised in the palace of the gods. He was raised in the wilderness by nymphs, in hiding, in the way that the mythology's most important beings always seem to be raised. Like Zeus on Crete, like Achilles in the care of the centaur Chiron, like Oedipus abandoned by his parents to die on a hillside. The significant births were never the straightforward births. The gods who would matter most arrived in the world sideways, through complications and concealments and multiple births, and the specific kind of difficulty that made them into what they needed to be. Dionysus was the god of wine. This is the simplest and most commonly stated description of his domain, and it is accurate as far as it goes, but it does not go nearly far enough. Wine was the medium of his divine quality, not the quality itself. What wine produced was the thing Dionysus actually governed: the dissolution of boundaries, the temporary suspension of the categories that ordinary consciousness maintained, the state in which the division between self and other, between the individual and the group, between the civilized and the animal, between the controlled and the uncontrolled, became permeable. When you drank wine in sufficient quantity, you stopped being entirely yourself. Your inhibitions loosened. Your customary self-presentation dissolved. The careful management of your public identity relaxed. Things that you had been containing came out. Things you would not normally say or do or feel became available to you. The ordinary boundaries of your personality became negotiable. Dionysus governed that. Not the wine itself, but the state that wine induced. And not just wine. The ecstatic state was available through other means too. Through the specific kind of group dancing and music that Dionysus's worship involved. Through the madness that he could induce in those who resisted him. Through the encounter with something so overwhelming that the ordinary structures of consciousness gave way. He was the god of theater, the great dramatic tradition of Athens, the tragedy and the comedy that would shape Western literature for 3 millennia, emerged from his festivals. The Dionysia, the festival of Dionysus in Athens, was the occasion on which the plays of Sophocles and Euripides and Aeschylus were first performed. Theater was, in the Greek understanding, a form of the Dionysian experience. You sat in the audience, and you were transported out of your ordinary self into the experience of characters who were not you. Your boundaries dissolved in a controlled way. You felt what the character felt. You were temporarily something else. And then the play ended and you were yourself again, changed by what you had experienced, enriched by the dissolution. He was the god of the irrational, in a world that valued reason. The Greeks were a civilization that prized the rational mind, that produced philosophy and logic and the methods of systematic inquiry. And simultaneously, they were a civilization that recognized the existence and the necessity of the irrational, of the part of human experience that reason could not govern, of the ecstasy and the madness and the dissolution that came when something too large for ordinary consciousness arrived. Dionysus was that part, the god of what the rational mind could not contain, the god of the experience that exceeded what the categories of reason could hold. He was the last Olympian to arrive in the divine community, and in some traditions he replaced Hestia in the 12 thrones, the domestic warmth making room for the wild ecstasy, the fire giving way to the vine. His arrival was difficult. Hera pursued him. He was driven to madness by the goddess who had destroyed his mother. He wandered. He traveled to India and to Egypt and across the Eastern world, spreading his worship and his vine and the specific quality of experience that he offered to those who accepted him. He returned to Greece having established his presence across the world. And when he came to claim his place in the divine order accepted him, reluctantly in some versions, with the recognition in others that what he represented was necessary, that a divine community without the god of the irrational was a divine community that had decided it was entirely rational, which was itself a form of madness. He was the last to arrive. He was the most human of the gods, because he was the child of a mortal woman, because he had been born human, in the sense of being born from a human mother, before being completed in the divine body of his father. He carried both, the human and the divine, the mortal and the immortal, the rational and the irrational. Twice born Dionysus, born once in fire and once in flesh, born of a mortal mother who burned in the light of his divine father, and a divine father who carried the unfinished child in his own body until it was ready. The last Olympian, the most human, the most wild, the god who reminded the divine order that reason was not the only way to be. He arrived at Olympus with his grapevine and his thyrsus, the staff topped with a pine cone that was his emblem. He sat down at the divine table. The 12 thrones were full. The Olympian order was complete. 12. The number had been there from the beginning. Hephaestus had built 12 thrones in the great hall of Olympus before all 12 of their occupants had been born. The divine craftsman had understood something about completeness that the divine community was still in the process of achieving. He had built for what was coming. He had prepared the space for the full expression of the Olympian order before that expression existed. Now it existed. The 12 thrones in the great hall of Olympus were occupied. The complete divine order had assembled itself through births and arrivals and the specific journeys that each of the 12 had taken to arrive at their place in the configuration. And what they represented, taken together, was the full range of what existence required to be governed. Let us account for all 12. Let us see them together in the configuration that would define the divine world for the rest of the mythology. Zeus sat at the center, the king of gods, the ruler of the sky, and through the sky the ruler of everything that existed beneath it. the god of lightning and of law and of the divine order that he had won through the Titanomachy and maintained through the governance that followed. The hidden child of Kronos and Rhea, raised in a cave on Crete, who had freed his siblings and freed the Cyclopes and freed the Cinemanes and fought 10 years of war and drawn lots with his brothers and taken the sky. He was not a simple ruler. He was not simply powerful. He was the being who had grown up knowing that power without something deeper behind it was what Kronos had been, and Kronos had swallowed his children and been overthrown. Zeus was the king who had been a child in hiding, who had learned what it meant to need others before he learned what it meant to command them, who carried within him the specific education of someone who had been vulnerable before he was powerful. He was also unfaithful and jealous, and sometimes unjust and capable of terrible things. The mythology did not edit these qualities out of him. He was the ruler of the divine world as a complex being, not as an ideal one. Hera sat beside him, the queen, the goddess of marriage and family and the sacred bond, the most wronged being on Olympus, married to the god who most thoroughly violated the principles she embodied. Her pride and her fury were as present at the divine table as her authority. She was the queen, undeniably and completely, and the mythology's treatment of her never reduced her to simply the jealous wife. She was the jealous wife because she was the goddess of marriage, and her marriage was an ongoing violation of everything she was. Poseidon, the sea, fully expressed, the earth shaker, the wielder of the trident, the most volatile of the brothers, the one whose personal grievances expressed themselves as meteorological events affecting everyone in their vicinity. He sat at his throne with the weight of the ocean behind him and the ungovernable force of the deep water present in everything he said and did. Demeter, the grain, the harvest, the turning of the seasons, the goddess whose grief created winter and whose joy created spring, the being on whom all mortal life most directly depended, because without her gifts there was no food, and without food there was nothing else. She sat at her throne with the earth's fertility present in her like a warmth that radiated outward. Hestia, the hearth, or the throne that had been prepared for the hearth goddess. She was present on Olympus in the specific way that warmth was present everywhere, not in a throne but in the fires that burned in every home. She had given up her place at the divine table, in the tradition that said Dionysus took her throne and she had chosen the hearth. Even in her absence from the formal throne, she was more universally present than any other Olympian. Hades, rarely on Olympus. His domain was below, his kingdom was the dead, his palace was at the bottom of the world. He sat at his throne on the occasions when he came, the pale god of the underworld looking at his divine family with the impartial gaze of someone who received all of them eventually. Apollo, light and truth and music and prophecy, the god of the clear sky and the rational mind, the inhabitant of Delphi and the driver of the sun chariot and the killer of the python and the archer whose silver arrows brought both healing and plague. He sat at his throne with the specific quality of someone who understood things that others found unclear and who had chosen, as his primary function, to share that understanding. Artemis, the twin sister, the wild places and the hunt and the moon and the protection of the vulnerable, the goddess of the darkness between stars and the animals moving through the night forest, and the births that happened in pain and danger, and that she had been present at since the moment of her own birth. She sat at her throne with the particular quality of someone who preferred the wild to the civilized, and who came to Olympus as a visitor from a world that the other gods rarely fully entered. Athena, wisdom and craft and strategic warfare, the goddess of the applied mind, the patron of Athens and of civilization in its most rational and most structured expression. She sat in her armor with her owl on her shoulder and her gray eyes that saw through things, the goddess born from the head of Zeus, the being who was more completely his daughter than any of his other children because she had come from him directly, without the complication of another parent. Ares, war in its raw and immediate form, the violence of the battlefield, the specific madness of combat, the beautiful and terrible god of the killing that the ancient world contained as much of as the modern world does. He sat at his throne with the quality of someone who was most fully himself when everything was breaking, who was the divine embodiment of the force that human civilization has never found a way to fully contain. Aphrodite, desire and love and beauty and the overwhelming force of attraction. The goddess who was older than the Olympian order, born before the Titanomachy, present in the world since before Zeus was born. She sat at her throne with the quality that required no demonstration, that was simply present in the room with her, making the air different wherever she was. Hephaestus, the craftsman, the maker, the god whose lameness was the mythology's most specific statement about the relationship between physical imperfection and the creation of extraordinary things. He sat at his throne and he was already thinking about the next thing he would make, already seeing the potential in materials that others overlooked, already inhabiting the space between what existed and what could exist if the right hands worked on it. Hermes, the messenger, the traveler, the thief, the guide of souls, the god of all the boundaries and thresholds and transitions and in-between spaces that existence required. He sat at his throne with the quality of someone who was never quite still, who was already planning the next journey, who could be here and elsewhere simultaneously in a way that the other gods could not quite manage. And Dionysus, the last to arrive, the twice-born, the most human of the gods and the most wild, the god of wine and theater and the dissolution that allowed people to experience what ordinary consciousness prevented them from experiencing. He sat at the table that had been kept for him, or that Hestia had vacated for him, with the grapevine at his side and the specific quality of someone who arrived at every gathering after everyone else and made the gathering different by being there. 12 divine beings, 12 domains, the complete governance of existence, the sky and the order it imposed on everything below, the sea and the ungovernable force that connected and threatened simultaneously, the harvest and the seasons and the agricultural cycle that made civilization possible, the warmth of the hearth that made the domestic life livable, the realm of the dead that received everything living eventually, the light of reason and the light of the wild moon, the goddess of the applied mind and the god of raw violence, the craftsman who made what was needed and the messenger who carried what needed to be carried, love and desire and the force of attraction, the dissolving ecstasy of the irrational, and at the center of all of it, the complicated, powerful, unfaithful, sometimes unjust, often magnificent king of gods, and the proud and wronged and absolutely royal queen at his side. This is the Olympian order. This is what the mythology had been building toward since chaos first stirred and Gaia emerged, and the Titans were born, and the fear took hold, and the war was fought. This configuration of 12 divine beings around a table in a palace above the clouds of a mountain in northern Greece. It was not perfect. It was never going to be perfect. The beings who sat at that table were too complicated, too distinct, too fully themselves to form a perfect, harmonious unity. They argued, they competed, they pursued conflicting interests. They backed different sides in mortal conflicts. They fell in love with the same mortals and sent their children into competition with each other. But they were complete, in the sense that the 12 together covered what needed to be covered. They were the full range of divine governance that the world required. Every aspect of existence that needed a divine presence had won. Every force that shaped mortal life had its Olympian counterpart. Every dimension of what it meant to be alive in the ancient Greek world was governed by one of the 12. The 12 thrones in the great hall of Olympus, built by Hephaestus, the craftsman, who had understood completeness before the complete set of those who would sit in them had been born. All 12 occupied, the Olympian order complete, the age of Zeus fully established, and below Olympus, below the clouds, below the ether, the mortal world going about its business. Farmers planting their fields, sailors crossing the sea, heroes beginning the journeys that would make them heroes, mortals loving and fighting and building and destroying and doing all the things that mortals did in the world that the 12 gods now governed from their thrones above the clouds. The mythology was fully underway. Everything that was going to happen was now going to happen in this world, governed by these 12, inhabited by mortals who prayed to them and feared them and loved them and sometimes challenged them and always lived under the sky that Zeus governed and on the earth that Demeter sustained and in the knowledge that one day Hades would receive them. The 12 thrones, the complete divine order, the world as the ancient Greeks understood it, finally and fully assembled. And the stories were only beginning. This is where we leave you for tonight. But the story isn't over. The divine order is complete, but the world below Olympus is empty of something the gods have not yet made. A titan will take clay from the riverbank and shape it into a form no one has seen before. And what he breathes into it will change everything. Next time, Prometheus and the creation of humanity. This is a chronological series. Every episode picks up exactly where the last one left. You don't need to hold anything in your mind right now. Just rest. Your body needs this. Your mind needs this. And we'll be here every 2 days with the next chapter. Tomorrow, and we say this with certainty, the names you heard tonight will feel more familiar. That is not nothing. That is exactly what this time was for. Millions of people lie awake at night convinced they are falling behind, that every hour of sleep is an hour lost. You know something they haven't figured out yet. This time was not wasted. It never was. If tonight felt like something, if these stories found you at the right moment, subscribe and join us. Leave a comment. Hit like. We're building this community together, and your support helps us keep going. And if you'd like to know how much sleep your mind and body actually need, not a general answer, yours specifically, visit us at GeniusSleep.rest. We built a free sleep calculator there just for you. Enter your age, your lifestyle, your daily rhythm, and it will tell you exactly how much sleep your body needs. You can also find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music. Every episode, every night, wherever you listen. Genius Sleep Academy will be here every time you close your eyes. Sleep well.